Nightmare at the End of the Hall. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The envelope lay on Laurel Snow's desk like a curse made manifest, its crisp white edges a stark contrast against the dark mahogany. Weak autumn sunlight filtered through the study's bay window, casting long shadows across the room and glinting off the golden wax seal that bore the unmistakable crest of Douglas Academy. Laurel's fingers hovered over the envelope, trembling slightly. She'd recognized the handwriting immediately, the elegant, sweeping script of Headmaster Ramsay. It had been 15 years since she'd last seen it, scrawled across her diploma in black ink that seemed to bleed into the parchment like an omen. With a deep breath, she broke the seal. The letter inside was heavy, expensive paper that crackled as she unfolded it. The scent of old books and polished wood wafted up, instantly transporting her back to the hallowed halls of her alma mater. Laurel closed her eyes, fighting against the tide of memories that threatened to overwhelm her. Jane's laughter echoing down the corridor, the weight of secrets shared in whispered conversations, the suffocating silence that followed that final terrible night. Forcing her eyes open, Laurel began to read. "Dear Miss Snow, it is with great pleasure that I extend to you an invitation to return to Douglas Academy as our esteemed writer-in-residence for the upcoming semester." The words blurred as Laurel's mind raced. Return to Douglas. The very thought made her stomach churn. She'd spent the last decade and a half carefully constructing a life as far removed from those memories as possible. Her novels, critically acclaimed explorations of guilt, memory and the haunting power of the past, were her way of exorcising those demons, of keeping them safely confined to the page. But now, with this invitation, the carefully maintained walls between past and present began to crumble. Laurel stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. She paced the length of her study, the letter clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound classics and modern paperbacks alike. Her own work stood in a neat row on the top shelf. 5 novels that had cemented her reputation as one of the most promising authors of her generation. Her eyes fell on the spine of her most famous work, The Door in the Dark. The title seemed to mock her now, a reminder of the secrets that still lurked in the shadows of her mind. The shrill ring of her phone cut through the silence, making Laurel jump. She fumbled for the device, her heart racing as she saw the name on the screen. "Jamie." "Hello?" Laurel answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "Law, did you get it?" Jamie's excitement crackled through the line. "The invitation from Douglas." Laurel sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "How did you know about that?" "Oh, honey, everyone knows. It's all over the alumni message boards. The great Laurel Snow, returning to her roots." Jamie paused, her tone softening. "Are you okay? I know it's a lot to process, a lot to process. The understatement of the century." Laurel pinched the bridge of her nose, fighting back a headache. I don't know, Jamie. I can't go back there." "You know why?" There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Jamie spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "It's been 15 years, Law. Maybe it's time to face those ghosts head on. You can't keep running forever." "Can't I?" Laurel thought bitterly. But even as the thought formed, she knew Jamie was right. The nightmares, the lingering questions, the guilt that gnawed at her soul, none of it had faded with time. If anything, it had only grown stronger, feeding on her silence and evasion. "What if?" Laurel's voice faltered. She cleared her throat and tried again. "What if I go back and it's worse? What if I discover something I'm not prepared to face?" Jamie's laugh was warm, comforting. "Then you'll write one hell of a book about it, won't you?" "Isn't that what you do best? Turn your demons into art?" Despite herself, Laurel felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You make it sound so simple." "Nothing worth doing is ever simple, darling, but I think you need this. Closure, catharsis, or just a chance to prove to yourself that the past doesn't own you anymore? Laurel's gaze drifted to the window, where the last rays of sunlight were fading into twilight. Shadows lengthened across her manicured lawn, and for a moment she could almost see the imposing silhouette of Douglas Academy superimposed over the peaceful suburban scene. "I'll think about it," she said finally. After ending the call, Laurel sat in the growing darkness, the invitation still clutched in her hand. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to decline, to stay safe in the life she'd built for herself. But beneath that, a small, insistent voice whispered of unfinished business and unanswered questions. With a decisive motion, she reached for her laptop. The screen's blue glow illuminated her face as she began to type. "Dear Headmaster Ramsay, I am honored to accept your invitation." As Laurel hit send, a chill ran down her spine. In the reflection of the darkened window, just for a moment, she could have sworn she saw a familiar face looking back at her, young, beautiful, and terribly, hauntingly sad. Jane. But when Laurel blinked, the apparition was gone, leaving her alone with the weight of her decision and the inescapable feeling that by accepting this invitation, she had set in motion events that would change her life forever. Outside, a lone owl hooted mournfully, its cry carrying on the wind like a warning. Or perhaps, Laurel thought with a shiver, like a welcome home. Chapter 2. Arrival. The iron gates of Douglas Academy loomed before Laurel, their intricate scrollwork spelling out the school's motto in tarnished Latin, Lux in tenebris, light in darkness. As her taxi crawled up the winding driveway, Laurel felt a familiar tightness in her chest, as if the very air around the school was growing thicker, more oppressive. Autumn had painted the campus in shades of burnt orange and deep crimson, a stark contrast to the grey stone of the Gothic Revival buildings. Students in crisp uniforms hurried across the quad, their laughter carried on the chill breeze. To an outsider it might have seemed idyllic. But Laurel knew better. She could feel the weight of history and secrets pressing down, as tangible as the mists that clung to the shadowed corners of the grounds. The taxi came to a stop before the main entrance, and Laurel steeled herself before stepping out. The crunch of gravel under her feet sent a jolt of memory through her. How many times had she walked this path as a student, unaware of the tragedy that lay ahead? "Miss Snow," a booming voice cut through her reverie. "Welcome back to Douglas Academy." Headmaster Ramsay strode towards her, his silver hair gleaming in the weak sunlight. He looked older than Laurel remembered, lines etched deeply around his eyes and mouth, but his handshake was firm as he greeted her. "Headmaster," Laurel nodded, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Thank you for the invitation." "Please call me Charles," he insisted, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We're colleagues now, after all." As they walked towards the main building, Laurel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Jane's ghost trailing behind them. Instead, she caught sight of a young student staring at her intently from a second-floor window. The girl's face was partially obscured by a curtain, but there was something in her expression, a mixture of curiosity and something darker, that sent a chill down Laurel's spine. "I hope you'll find everything to your liking," Ramsay was saying as they entered the cavernous main hall. "We've prepared the old East Wing guest suite for you. I believe you'll find it familiar." Laurel's step faltered. The East Wing, where she and Jane had spent countless nights whispering secrets and dreams, where they had last spoken before. She swallowed hard. "That's very kind of you, Headmaster. But perhaps another room would be more appropriate." Ramsay's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Nonsense. It's our finest accommodation. Unless, of course, there's some reason you'd prefer not to stay there." The challenge in his tone was clear. Laurel met his gaze, refusing to back down. "No reason at all. The East Wing will be perfect." As they continued their tour, Laurel noticed subtle changes to the school. New security cameras blinked from discreet corners. The library had been expanded, its windows now equipped with heavy iron bars. And everywhere she looked, she saw small touches that seemed designed to erase the past. Fresh paint covering old graffiti, new furniture replacing pieces she remembered. But some things remained unchanged. The portrait of the school's founder still hung in the main hall, his stern gaze following visitors as they passed. The faint scent of beeswax and old books permeated the air. And there, half hidden behind a potted plant, was the small chip in the marble flooring where Jane had once dropped a heavy textbook, earning them both a week's detention. "We're thrilled to have you join our faculty," Ramsay said as they approached the staff wing. "Your success as an author has brought great pride to Douglas, though I must admit some of your work has raised." Eyebrows among the board of trustees, Laurel tensed. "Oh," Ramsay's laugh was hollow. "Some felt that your novels hit a bit too close to home, shall we say. Particularly The Door in the Dark. One might almost think it was based on real events." Before Laurel could respond, a door ahead of them swung open and a familiar figure stepped out. Laurel Snow, is that really you?" Ian Blackwood hadn't changed much in 15 years. His dark hair was shot through with distinguished streaks of grey, but his eyes were as intense as ever as they locked onto Laurel's face. "Hello, Ian," Laurel managed, her throat suddenly dry. "It's been a long time." Ian moved towards them, his gait slightly uneven, a remnant of an old sports injury, Laurel remembered. "Indeed it has. Welcome back to Douglas." He extended his hand and Laurel shook it, acutely aware of the headmaster's scrutiny. "Mr. Blackwood has been an invaluable member of our English department," Ramsay interjected. "I'm sure you two will have much to discuss given your shared interests." The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Laurel forced a smile. "I look forward to it." As they continued down the hall, Laurel's mind raced. Ian's presence complicated things. He had been Jane's favourite teacher, the one she had trusted above all others. What did he know about those final days? And why did Laurel feel a nagging sense of suspicion every time she thought of his recent novel, a novel that bore an uncanny resemblance to her own work? They reached the east wing, and Ramsay pushed open the heavy oak door to Laurel's suite. "Here we are. I trust you'll find everything in order." Laurel stepped inside and the years fell away. The room was exactly as she remembered it. The four-poster bed draped in heavy velvet curtains, the antique writing desk positioned before the window overlooking the misty woods beyond the school grounds. For a moment she could almost hear Jane's laughter, smell the scent of her perfume. "Miss Snow." Ramsay's voice snapped her back to the present. "Is everything all right?" Laurel realized she had been standing frozen in the doorway. She forced herself to move, to breathe. "Yes, thank you, it's perfect." Ramsay nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Excellent. There's a faculty meeting at 7 in the main conference room. We look forward to officially introducing you to your colleagues." As the door closed behind him, Laurel sank onto the bed, her legs suddenly weak. She ran her hand over the familiar quilt, tracing the intricate pattern she had memorized so long ago. Being back in this room, surrounded by echoes of the past, was almost overwhelming. A glint of something caught her eye. Frowning, Laurel leaned closer to the bedside table. There, barely visible in the wood grain, was a set of initials carved with painstaking care: LS, JC, Laurel and Jane. A remnant of a time when their futures had seemed bright and limitless, before secrets and tragedy tore them apart. With trembling fingers, Laurel traced the letters. As she did, a sudden chill swept through the room, causing the curtains to flutter despite the closed windows. The lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied, and in the silence that followed, Laurel could have sworn she heard a whisper, so faint it might have been the wind, yet achingly familiar. "Welcome home, Laurel." "We've been waiting for you." Laurel jerked her hand back as if burned. She stood abruptly, her heart pounding. It was just her imagination, she told herself, the product of stress and jet lag and too many painful memories. But as she began to unpack her suitcase, Laurel couldn't shake the feeling that by returning to Douglas Academy, she had set foot on a path from which there was no turning back. Whatever ghosts lurked in these halls, whether real or metaphorical, she would have to face them head-on. The antique clock on the mantel chimed 6:30, startling Laurel out of her thoughts. The faculty meeting awaited, and with it the official beginning of her tenure at Douglas. She smoothed her hair, straightened her jacket, and took a deep breath. "It's just a school," she murmured to herself. "Just bricks and mortar and old memories." But as Laurel stepped out into the shadowy corridor, the weight of unseen eyes upon her, she knew that Douglas Academy was far more than that. It was a crucible of secrets, a labyrinth of half-truths and buried pain, and somewhere within its walls lay the answers she had spent 15 years running from, answers that, for better or worse, she was finally ready to uncover. Chapter 3. Ghosts of the Past. The morning light filtered weakly through the leaded glass windows of the classroom, casting long shadows across the worn wooden desks. Laurel stood at the front, acutely aware of the expectant gazes fixed upon her. 20 pairs of eyes, bright with curiosity and a hint of challenge, awaited her first words as Douglas Academy's new writer in residence. She cleared her throat, willing her voice to remain steady. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Laurel Snow, and I'll be leading this advanced creative writing seminar this semester." A ripple of whispers swept through the room. Laurel caught fragments. Famous author, alumna, and most unsettlingly, Jane Courtney's friend. Pushing aside the familiar pang of grief those words evoked, Laurel forged ahead. "We'll start with a simple exercise. I want you to write about a place that haunts you. Not necessarily in the supernatural sense, but a location that lingers in your memory, that shapes your thoughts and dreams." As the students bent over their notebooks, Laurel's gaze drifted to the window. The grounds of Douglas stretched out before her, a patchwork of manicured lawns and ancient trees. In the distance, barely visible through the morning mist, stood the old groundskeeper's cottage. Laurel's heart clenched. How many times had she and Jane snuck out to that cottage, sharing secrets and dreams under the stars? A movement at the back of the classroom snapped Laurel back to the present. A girl with long dark hair had raised her hand, her expression a mixture of eagerness and apprehension. "Yes," Laurel nodded to her. The girl's voice was soft but clear. "Miss Snow, is it true that your novel, The Door in the Dark, is based on real events that happened here at Douglas?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Laurel felt the weight of every gaze in the room, each student leaning forward slightly, hungry for insider knowledge or gossip. "All fiction draws from reality in some way," Laurel replied carefully. "But The Door in the Dark is just that, fiction. Now, let's focus on your own writing. Who would like to share what they've written so far?" As the class progressed, Laurel found herself relaxing slightly. The students were bright and engaged, their writing showing flashes of real talent. But beneath the normal ebb and flow of the lesson, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More than once, she caught herself glancing at the closed classroom door, half expecting to see a familiar face peering through the glass. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period. As the students filed out, Laurel began gathering her materials. A shadow fell across her desk. "Hello, Laurel." She looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Brett Ramsay stood before her, looking both familiar and strange. The boyish charm she remembered had matured into a rugged handsomeness, but there was a wariness in his eyes that was new. "Brett?" she managed, straightening up. "I didn't realize you were teaching here." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Following in my father's footsteps, I suppose. History department." An awkward silence stretched between them, years of unspoken words and shared history, creating an almost tangible barrier. Brett broke first. Listen, Laurel, I know things ended badly between us, but I'm glad you're back. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime. Catch up." Before Laurel could respond, a chill swept through the room. The lights flickered, and for a split second, Laurel could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the corner, a young woman with long dark hair and sad eyes. But when she blinked, there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" she gasped, her heart racing. Brett frowned, following her gaze. "See what?" Laurel shook her head, trying to calm her nerves. "Nothing. Just a trick of the light, I suppose." Brett's expression softened slightly. "Look, I know being back here must be difficult. If you need someone to talk to—" "Thank you." Laurel cut him off, perhaps more sharply than she intended. "But I'm fine. It was nice seeing you, Brett." He nodded, the wariness back in his eyes. "You too, Laurel. Take care of yourself." As Brett left the classroom, Laurel sank into her chair, her hands shaking slightly. She told herself it was just stress, just the emotional toll of being back at Douglas. But deep down she knew better. Whatever had happened in that moment, hallucination or something more, it had felt real. As real as the grief and guilt she'd carried for 15 years.
A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts.
She looked up to see Ian Blackwood standing in the doorway, a concerned expression on his face. "Everything all right, Laurel? You look like you've seen a ghost." The phrase hit too close to home. Laurel forced a smile. "Just first-day jitters, I suppose. Did you need something, Ian?" He stepped into the room, his limp more pronounced than she remembered. "I wanted to invite you to dinner, a sort of welcome-back celebration. My place tonight at 7. Laurel hesitated. Part of her wanted nothing more than to retreat to her room, to lose herself in writing and forget the strange occurrences of the day. But another part, the part that had driven her to return to Douglas in the first place, knew that Ian might have answers to questions she'd been too afraid to ask for far too long. "That sounds lovely," she heard herself say. "Thank you, Ian." He smiled, and for a moment Laurel saw a flash of the charismatic teacher Jane had admired so much. "Excellent. I'll see you then." As Ian left, Laurel turned back to the window. The mist had thickened, obscuring the grounds and creating the illusion that Douglas Academy existed in a world apart, cut off from reality. Perhaps, Laurel thought with a shiver, that wasn't so far from the truth. She gathered her things and stepped out into the corridor. The hallway stretched before her, shadows pooling in the corners despite the mid-morning hour. As Laurel walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. The click of her heels on the polished floor echoed strangely, sometimes sounding like a single set of footsteps, sometimes like two. At the end of the hall, just before rounding the corner, Laurel paused. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned to look back the way she'd come. For an instant so brief she might have imagined it, she saw a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. A young woman in an outdated Douglas Academy uniform, her long dark hair obscuring her face. The figure raised a hand, as if in greeting or warning, and then vanished. Laurel's breath caught in her throat. She blinked hard, but the hallway remained empty, silent save for the pounding of her own heart. "It's not real," she whispered to herself. "It can't be real." But as she hurried towards the safety of her room, Laurel knew that the line between reality and imagination, between past and present, was blurring. The ghosts of Douglas Academy, whether metaphorical or terrifyingly literal, were stirring, and somewhere in the maze of half-truths and buried secrets, the truth about Jane's death was waiting to be uncovered. Laurel only hoped she had the strength to face it when the time came. Chapter 4. The Locked Room. The antique clock in Laurel's room chimed 6, its sonorous tones echoing through the cavernous space. She stood before the full-length mirror, smoothing down her black dress and wondering, not for the first time, if coming to Ian's dinner was a mistake. But curiosity and the persistent hope for answers outweighed her apprehension. As she reached for her coat, a glint of silver caught her eye. There, Half hidden beneath a pile of papers on her desk lay a small key. Laurel frowned. She didn't remember unpacking it, yet something about its intricate design tugged at her memory. Without thinking, she pocketed the key and headed out. The corridors of Douglas were eerily quiet at this hour, most students sequestered in their rooms or the library. Laurel's footsteps echoed off the stone walls as she made her way towards the faculty apartments. As she passed a row of classroom doors, a muffled sound made her pause. It came again, a soft thud, followed by what sounded like scratching. Laurel's heart quickened. The noise was coming from behind a door she had never noticed before, tucked away in an alcove. Drawn by an impulse she couldn't explain, Laurel approached the door. A newly installed brass plate gleamed in the dim light. Room 713, student quarters. "Hello!" Laurel called softly, knocking on the heavy wood. "Is someone in there?" Silence answered her. She was about to turn away when she felt a sudden weight in her pocket. The key. With trembling fingers, Laurel withdrew it, a chill running down her spine as she realized it was an exact match for the lock before her. "This is madness," she thought. "I shouldn't be here." But even as the rational part of her brain screamed warnings, Laurel found herself inserting the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The door swung open, revealing a room that was at once familiar and utterly foreign. What had once been a cluttered storage space had been converted into a small but comfortable student dormitory. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a desk and wardrobe against the other, but it was the far corner that drew Laurel's gaze and stole her breath. There, partially hidden by shadows, stood an easel, and on that easel was a half-finished painting of a face Laurel knew as well as her own. Jane Courtney, forever frozen at 18, her eyes seeming to follow Laurel as she stepped into the room. "This isn't possible," Laurel whispered, her voice sounding strange in the enclosed space. She moved closer to the painting, drawn by an impulse beyond her control. As she did, her foot caught on something. Laurel looked down to see a small notebook lying open on the floor, its pages covered in tight, familiar handwriting. With shaking hands, she picked it up and began to read. "September 15th. The dreams are getting worse. I see her everywhere, in the mirror, in the shadows, in the faces of strangers. She's trying to tell me something, I know it. But I'm afraid of what I'll learn if I listen. September 20th. Elle doesn't understand. How can she? She wasn't there that night. She doesn't know what really happened. Sometimes I think it would be easier if the entry cut off abruptly." Laurel flipped through the pages, her mind reeling. The handwriting was unmistakably that of a current student, yet the contents, it was as if someone was channeling Jane's thoughts, her fears. A soft click behind her made Laurel whirl around. The door had swung shut, trapping her in the room. Heart pounding, she rushed to it, twisting the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Hello," she called, her voice rising in panic. "Is anyone out there? I'm locked in." Silence answered her. Laurel turned back to the room, her eyes darting from the painting to the notebook, to the shadows that seemed to be growing deeper by the second. And then she saw it. A flicker of movement in the mirror above the desk. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Laurel saw two reflections staring back at her. Herself, pale and wide-eyed with fear, and behind her, a figure in an old-fashioned Douglas uniform, dark hair obscuring its face. Laurel stumbled backward, a scream catching in her throat. Her elbow knocked against the easel, sending Jane's portrait crashing to the floor. As it fell, something fluttered out from behind the canvas, a photograph, yellowed with age. With trembling fingers, Laurel picked it up. It showed two girls, arms around each other, laughing in the sunlight, herself and Jane on their first day at Douglas. But there was something wrong with the image. Where Jane's face should have been, there was only a dark smudge, as if someone had deliberately obscured her features. A cold breeze swept through the room, rustling the pages of the notebook and sending chills down Laurel's spine. And then, so faint she might have imagined it, a whisper, "Remember, Laurel, you have to remember." The lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, Laurel found herself alone once more. The painting was back on its easel, the notebook closed on the desk as if it had never been moved. And the door. Laurel rushed to it, twisting the handle. It opened easily, spilling her out into the hallway where she collided with a solid form. "Laurel." Ian's concerned face swam into focus. "What on earth are you doing here? I've been looking all over for you. You're late for dinner." Laurel opened her mouth to explain, to pour out the impossible things she had just experienced. But as she turned to gesture at the room, the words died on her lips. The door was gone. Where it had been was only smooth, unbroken wall. I got turned around," Laurel managed, her mind reeling. "I'm sorry, Ian. Shall we go to dinner?" As they walked away, Laurel couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something vital behind. The weight of the photograph burned in her pocket, a tangible reminder that what she had experienced was real. "Remember," the voice had said. But remember what? What was it about that night, about Jane's death, that she had locked away so thoroughly in her mind? One thing was certain. The mysteries of Douglas Academy ran deeper than Laurel had ever imagined, and somehow she knew that room 713, whether it existed in reality or only in some twilight realm between past and present, held the key to unravelling it all. As she followed Ian to his apartment, Laurel made a silent vow. She would find the truth, no matter where it led. For Jane's sake and for her own. The corridors of Douglas seemed to whisper around her, secrets hiding in every shadow. And somewhere, in a room that both existed and didn't, a half-finished portrait of Jane Courtney watched with knowing eyes, waiting for the moment when all would be revealed. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Halls. The morning after her unsettling experience with room 713 and the tense dinner with Ian, Laurel found herself wandering the halls of Douglas Academy in a daze. She had barely slept, her dreams haunted by flickering images of Jane and whispered warnings she couldn't quite remember upon waking. As she turned a corner, heading towards the library, the sound of hushed voices caught her attention. A group of students huddled near a bank of lockers, their heads bent close together in secretive conversation. Laurel slowed her pace, something in their furtive manner piquing her curiosity. "I'm telling you," a boy with tousled red hair was saying, his voice barely above a whisper, "my grandfather swears it's true. The Douglas massacre wasn't just some legend. It really happened." A girl with thick-rimmed glasses scoffed. "Right. And I suppose the ghosts are real too. You weren't here last year," another boy chimed in. "You didn't see what happened to Sarah in the old chapel." "How do you explain that?" Laurel's breath caught in her throat. She lingered by a display case, pretending to examine the academic trophies while straining to hear more. "Okay, but what does any of this have to do with MS Snow?" the bespectacled girl asked. The red-haired boy leaned in closer. "Don't you get it? Her friend, the one who died, I bet she knew something. I bet that's why." "That's enough, Mr. Hartley." Laurel startled at the sound of Brett's voice. She hadn't noticed him approach. The students scattered, looking guilty as Brett fixed them with a stern gaze. "Don't you all have classes to get to?" he asked pointedly. As the students hurried away, Brett turned to Laurel. His expression was unreadable. "You shouldn't encourage them, you know. These stories, they have a way of taking on a life of their own." Laurel met his gaze steadily. "And what if they're more than just stories, Brett? What if there's truth hidden in them?" A muscle twitched in Brett's jaw. "The past is the past, Laurel. Sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie." With that, he turned and strode away, leaving Laurel alone in the now silent hallway. Her mind racing, Laurel changed course and headed for the library. If she was going to uncover the truth about Jane's death and its possible connection to Douglas Academy's dark history, she needed to start at the beginning. The library was a cathedral of knowledge, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow far above. Rows upon rows of books stretched into the distance, their leather spines gleaming dully in the light from the stained-glass windows. Laurel made her way to the reference section, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As she ran her fingers along the spines of old yearbooks and school histories, a chill ran down her spine. She could have sworn she felt a presence behind her, but when she turned, there was only empty air. Shaking off the feeling, Laurel pulled out a heavy tome titled Douglas Academy, A Comprehensive History. She settled into a secluded corner and began to read. Hours passed as Laurel delved deeper into the school's past. She learned of its founding in 1823 by Ambrose Douglas, a man described as brilliant but troubled. She read accounts of the school's rise to prominence, its weathering of wars and economic depressions. But it was a small paragraph, almost hidden in a chapter about the school's expansion in the late 1800s, that made her blood run cold. In the winter of 1891, tragedy struck Douglas Academy. The details remain unclear, but contemporary accounts speak of a night of unspeakable violence that left 17 students and 3 faculty members dead. The event, which came to be known as the Douglas Massacre, was officially attributed to a student driven mad by the pressures of academia. However, rumours persisted of darker forces at work. Laurel's hands shook as she turned the page, but frustratingly there was no more information about the massacre. It was as if the school's historians had deliberately glossed over the event. A soft thud made her look up. A book had fallen from a nearby shelf, landing open on the floor. Laurel glanced around, but she was alone in this section of the library. Frowning, she rose to replace the book, but something about the open page caught her eye. It was a collection of local folklore, open to a chapter about Douglas Academy. Laurel's eyes widened as she read, "The spirits of those lost in the Douglas Massacre are said to still roam the halls of the Academy. Some say they seek justice, others vengeance. But all agree, when the veil between worlds is thin, the ghosts of Douglas Academy stir." A gust of wind swept through the library, ruffling the pages of the books and sending a shower of dust motes swirling through the air. Laurel sneezed, and in that moment of closed eyes she could have sworn she heard a whisper, "Dig deeper, Laurel. The truth lies beneath." Her heart pounding, Laurel gathered the books and hurried to the checkout desk. As the elderly librarian stamped the due date, she fixed Laurel with a knowing look. "Be careful, dear," the woman said, her voice creaking like old floorboards. "Some knowledge comes at a price." Laurel nodded, clutching the books to her chest as she hurried out of the library. She had just reached the main hallway when a commotion near the administration offices caught her attention. A group of students and teachers had gathered, their voices raised in confusion and alarm. Laurel approached cautiously, trying to see what had caused the disturbance. And then she saw it. The wall outside the headmaster's office, which had been blank that morning, was now covered in what looked like old-fashioned photographs. But as Laurel drew closer, her blood turned to ice. Every photograph showed the same scene, a group of students and teachers, their faces blurred and indistinct, standing in front of Douglas Academy. And in each photo, lurking in the background, was a figure in black, its face a void of darkness. But it was the words, scrawled in what looked horribly like blood across the photos, that made Laurel's world tilt on its axis. Remember the 17? The debt must be paid. As chaos erupted around her, Laurel stood rooted to the spot, her mind reeling. The Douglas Massacre, the whispers of ghosts, Jane's death, somehow she knew they were all connected, and she was beginning to suspect that her return to Douglas Academy was no coincidence. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows of the past. And Laurel was more determined than ever to uncover it, no matter the cost. As she turned away from the disturbing scene, Laurel caught sight of Brett watching her from across the hall. The look in his eyes was one of fear, not of the supernatural occurrence they had just witnessed, but of Laurel herself. In that moment, Laurel knew with chilling certainty that Brett knew more than he was letting on, and she would find out what it was, even if she had to confront the ghosts of Douglas Academy to do it. Chapter 6. The Plagiarism Accusation. The knock on Ian Blackwood's office door was sharp, decisive. Laurel didn't wait for a response before entering, her copy of Ian's novel clutched tightly in one hand, her own The Door in the Dark in the other. Ian looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his features before settling into a guarded smile. "Laurel, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Laurel shut the door behind her, the soft click echoing in the suddenly tense atmosphere. "We need to talk, Ian, about your book." She approached his desk, noting how he subtly shifted in his chair, as if preparing for a confrontation. The office was cluttered but cozy, walls lined with bookshelves and a large window overlooking the misty grounds of Douglas Academy. In any other circumstance, it might have been inviting. Now it felt like an arena. "Oh," Ian's voice was carefully neutral. "I didn't realize you'd had a chance to read it yet. What did you think?" Laurel placed both books on his desk side by side. "I think," she said slowly, "that there are some striking similarities between your novel and mine. Similarities that go beyond mere coincidence." Ian's eyes flicked between the books, then back to Laurel's face. "I'm not sure I follow. Don't you?" Laurel opened both books to specific passages she had marked. The protagonist's journey into her past, the hidden room with the mysterious painting, even some of the phrasing. "It's as if you took my work and twisted it, Ian, made it darker, more." She hesitated, searching for the right word, more true to what really happened. A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes, a mournful sound that seemed to underscore the tension in the room. Finally, Ian sighed, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. "Laurel, I can assure you I didn't plagiarize your work. Any similarities are purely coincidental." "Are they?" Laurel leaned forward, her hands flat on his desk. "Because I'm starting to think there's a lot more going on here than just literary inspiration. You were close to Jane. Closer than most people knew, weren't you?" Ian's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly sharp. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking directly. What was the nature of your relationship with Jane Courtney?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and long-buried secrets. Ian stood abruptly, moving to the window. For a long moment he stared out at the grounds, his back to Laurel. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tinged with an emotion Laurel couldn't quite place. Jane was special, brilliant, troubled and wise beyond her years. She saw things others didn't or couldn't. He turned back to face Laurel, his expression a mix of pain and something that might have been guilt. "Our relationship was complicated, Laurel. She came to me for guidance, yes, but it became more than that. She confided in me about things I'm not sure she ever told anyone else." "Not even you?" Laurel felt a chill run down her spine. "What things?" Ian shook his head. "I can't betray her confidence even now. But I will say this. Jane was afraid. In the weeks before her death, she became convinced that something dark was stirring at Douglas. Something connected to the old stories, the legends we all dismissed as mere superstition." He moved back to his desk, picking up his novel. "This book. It wasn't plagiarism, Laurel. It was an attempt to tell Jane's story, to honor her memory in the only way I knew how. I drew inspiration from your work because you captured a part of Jane I never could. But the heart of this story, that came from Jane herself." Laurel sank into a chair, her mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years I thought I knew everything about Jane's last days." "But you're saying there was this whole other side to her I never saw." Ian's expression softened. "Jane protected you, Laurel. She cared about you deeply, and she didn't want to drag you into whatever it was she thought she was uncovering. A memory stirred in Laurel's mind, Jane, pale and drawn, whispering something about doors that shouldn't be opened and debts long overdue. At the time, Laurel had dismissed it as stress-induced rambling. Now she wasn't so sure. "The Douglas massacre," Laurel said suddenly. "Did Jane ever mention it to you?" Ian's sharp intake of breath was answer enough. "How do you know about that?" Laurel quickly recounted her discoveries in the library and the disturbing incident outside the headmaster's office. With each word, Ian's face grew paler. "Oh, Jane," he murmured, "what did you uncover?" He turned to a locked drawer in his desk, withdrawing a small leather-bound journal. "I shouldn't show you this. I've kept it hidden all these years, unsure of what to do with it. But maybe it's time." He handed the journal to Laurel. "This was Jane's. She gave it to me the night before she died, made me promise to keep it safe. I've never been able to bring myself to read it all the way through." Laurel's hands trembled as she took the journal. "Why are you giving this to me now?" Ian's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Because I think you're the only one who can finish what Jane started. But Laurel, be careful. There are forces at work here that go beyond anything we understood. Jane's death. I'm not convinced it was suicide." A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Headmaster Ramsey's voice called out, "Ian! Are you in there? We need to discuss the upcoming board meeting." Ian quickly ushered Laurel towards a side door. "Go, read the journal, but be discreet. And Laurel—" He gripped her arm, his voice urgent. "Trust no one, not even me." As Laurel slipped out of the office, Jane's journal clutched to her chest. She felt as though she had stepped off the edge of a cliff. The ground beneath her feet was no longer stable, the truth she thought she knew crumbling away. She hurried back to her room, locking the door behind her. As she settled onto her bed, the journal heavy in her hands, Laurel couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, more alive somehow. With a deep breath, she opened the journal to the first page. Jane's familiar handwriting greeted her. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and it means the darkness I've uncovered is real. Laurel, my dear friend, I'm so sorry for what I'm about to drag you into, but you're the only one I trust to see this through. Remember the door in the dark. It's time to step through." As Laurel read on, the wind outside her window rose to a howl, as if the very ghosts of Douglas Academy were crying out in warning, or in welcome. Chapter 7. Brett's Confession. The clock on Laurel's nightstand blinked an accusing 2:17 a.m. She had been poring over Jane's journal for hours, each page revealing new layers of mystery and dread. Her eyes burned, her mind reeled, but sleep remained elusive. A soft knock at her door startled her from her reverie. Laurel froze, listening. It came again, more insistent this time. "Laurel!" Brett's voice, barely above a whisper. "It's me. We need to talk." Heart pounding, Laurel slipped Jane's journal under her pillow and moved to the door. She opened it a crack, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. Brett stood there, his face haggard, eyes darting nervously. "Brett, what are you doing here at this hour?" He ran a hand through his dishevelled hair. "Can I come in? Please, it's important." Against her better judgment, Laurel stepped aside, allowing him to enter. As she closed the door, she caught a whiff of whiskey on his breath. "Have you been drinking?" she asked, eyebrow raised. Brett sank into the armchair by the window, his shoulders slumped. "Just a bit. To work up the courage, I suppose."
"Courage for what?"
He looked up at her, his eyes haunted.
"To tell you the truth."
"About that night? About Jane?" Laurel's breath caught in her throat. She perched on the edge of her bed, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm listening." Brett took a deep, shuddering breath. "Do you remember the week before? Before it happened, Jane had been acting strange, paranoid. She kept talking about hidden rooms and old debts." Laurel nodded, thinking of the journal hidden beneath her pillow. "Go on." "The night she died, I saw her sneaking out of the dorms. I followed her. She went to the old chapel, the one that's been closed off for years. Brett's voice dropped to a whisper. She wasn't alone, Laurel. A chill ran down Laurel's spine. Who was she with? Brett shook his head. I couldn't see clearly. It was dark, and I was too afraid to get closer. But there were voices, arguing. Jane was shouting about needing more time, about breaking some kind of cycle. He paused, swallowing hard. And then there was a scream. By the time I worked up the courage to go inside, Jane was. She was. Tears glistened in Brett's eyes. Laurel felt her own vision blur, memories of that terrible night flooding back. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? She asked, her voice hoarse. Brett laughed bitterly. Who would have believed me? My father, the great headmaster Ramsay, made it clear that the official story was suicide. End of discussion. Laurel stood pacing the small room.
But surely the police in this town have always been in my father's pocket, Brett interrupted.
It was all swept under the rug so quickly, and I was a coward. I convinced myself it was better to stay quiet, to protect the school's reputation, to protect my father. He buried his face in his hands. I've carried this guilt for 15 years, Laurel. Seeing you again, knowing you're digging into the past, I couldn't keep it inside anymore. Laurel's mind raced, trying to reconcile Brett's confession with what she had read in Jane's journal. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than she had imagined. Brett, she said slowly, what do you know about the Douglas massacre? His head snapped up, eyes wide with fear. Where did you hear about that? It doesn't matter. What do you know? Brett stood, moving to the window. He stared out into the darkness, his reflection ghostly in the glass. It's just an old legend, a ghost story to scare new students. But Laurel could hear the tremor in his voice. Is it? Because Jane seemed to think it was much more than that. And after what I've seen in the past few days, I'm inclined to believe her. Brett turned to face her, his expression a mix of fear and resignation. Laurel, please, let this go. You have no idea what you're getting into. And tell me. Laurel's voice rose, frustration and fear bubbling over. Stop with the cryptic warnings and half-truths. Jane was my best friend, and I deserve to know what really happened to her. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, making them both jump. For a moment, Laurel could have sworn she saw a figure reflected in the glass behind Brett, a young woman with long dark hair reaching out as if to touch him. Brett stumbled back from the window, his face pale. Did you see that? Laurel's heart pounded. See what? He shook his head, rubbing his eyes. Nothing, I'm just tired and drunk, I should go. As he moved towards the door, Laurel grabbed his arm. Brett, wait. There's more to this, isn't there? More than what you've told me. He hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. Laurel, some secrets are buried for a reason. Some doors are meant to stay closed. The door in the dark? Laurel whispered, remembering Jane's words. Brett's eyes widened. What did you say? But before Laurel could respond, a scream echoed through the hallway outside. They both froze, listening. It came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Brett yanked open the door. In the corridor, students were emerging from their rooms, faces confused and frightened. A girl came running towards them, her nightgown billowing behind her. Help, she cried. Someone help! There's a body in the old chapel. Laurel and Brett exchanged a look of horror. Without a word, they both took off running, following the growing crowd towards the chapel. As they raced through the darkened halls of Douglas Academy, Laurel's mind whirled. Jane's journal, Brett's confession, the legends of the Douglas massacre. It was all connected, she was sure of it now. And whatever dark secret lay at the heart of it all, she had a terrible feeling that history was about to repeat itself. The old chapel loomed before them, its Gothic spires reaching into the starless night sky. As they approached, Laurel could hear the murmur of voices, the flash of smartphone cameras. And beneath it all, a low, keening wail that raised the hair on the back of her neck. Brett grabbed her arm, holding her back. "Laurel, wait. Whatever's in there. Are you sure you want to see it?" She met his gaze, seeing her own fear and determination reflected back at her. "I'm sure of only one thing, Brett. The truth about Jane's death is in that chapel, and I'm going to find it no matter what." With that, she pulled away from him and stepped into the chapel, the darkness enveloping her like a shroud. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw the crowd gathered at the far end near the altar, and there, illuminated by the harsh glare of phone flashlights, was a sight that would haunt her dreams for years to come. A body sprawled across the ancient stone floor, and on the wall above, written in what looked horribly like fresh blood, were the words, "The cycle continues. 17 more must pay." Laurel's world tilted, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. As she felt herself begin to fall, strong arms caught her from behind. Brett's voice, tight with fear, whispered in her ear, "What have we done, Laurel? What have we awakened?" But as consciousness slipped away, all Laurel could hear was Jane's voice echoing from the pages of her hidden journal. "The door in the dark is opening, Laurel, and once it's open, it can never be closed again." Chapter 8, The Journal. The soft glow of dawn was just beginning to creep through the windows of Laurel's room as she sat cross-legged on her bed, Jane's journal open before her. The events of the night, Brett's confession, the body in the chapel, the cryptic message in blood, swirled in her mind, a maelstrom of horror and confusion. But here, in the pages of Jane's private thoughts, Laurel hoped to find some answers. With trembling fingers, she turned to the first entry. "September 1st, I've decided to start this journal at the urging of Mr. Blackwood. He says it might help me make sense of everything. But how can I make sense of something I can barely believe myself? The dreams are getting worse. I see them every night now, the 17, their faces, their voices crying out for justice, for vengeance, and always, always that door. The door in the dark." Laurel's breath caught. The 17, it had to be referring to the victims of the Douglas massacre. But how could Jane have known about them? And what was this door she kept mentioning? She read on, the entries becoming more frantic, more disjointed as the weeks progressed. "September 15th, I found the hidden room today. Behind the false wall in the old library." The paintings, oh God, the paintings. 17 faces, all of them with their eyes scratched out, and the names written in what looked like blood. I recognized some of them from the old yearbooks, the victims of the massacre. But why hide this? Why keep this secret for over a century? September 20th, I confronted Headmaster Ramsay about the room. He denied everything, of course, but I saw the fear in his eyes. He knows, they all know. This place, this school, it's built on blood and lies. And somehow I'm connected to it all. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood. The cycle is nearing its end, and I'm afraid. I'm afraid I might be the key to starting it all over again. Laurel's mind reeled. A hidden room, a century-old cover-up. It seemed impossible. And yet, after everything she'd seen since returning to Douglas, she found herself believing every word. The next entry made her blood run cold. October 1st, I saw her again last night. The woman in black. She was standing at the foot of my bed, her face hidden in shadow. But I could hear her voice clear as day. 17 souls to pay the price. 17 lives to balance the scales, and 1 to bind them all. When I woke up, there was a key on my nightstand. A key I've never seen before. Old and rusted. I'm afraid to use it. I'm afraid of what door it might open. Laurel's hand went to her pocket, feeling the weight of the mysterious key she'd found in her room. Could it be the same one? Her heart pounding, she turned to the final entry, dated the day before Jane died, October 15th. This will be my last entry. I know now what I have to do. The cycle must be broken no matter the cost. Laurel, my dear friend, if you're reading this, and I pray that someday you will, I'm so sorry. Sorry for what I've done and for what I'm about to do. The truth is hidden in plain sight, in the very foundations of this cursed place. Find the door, Laurel, open it, but be prepared for what lies beyond. The darkness is hungry, and it's been waiting a very long time. Remember, lux in tenebris. Light in darkness. It's not just a motto, it's the key to everything. Forgive me. The journal fell from Laurel's numb fingers, landing on the bed with a soft thud. Tears streamed down her face as the full weight of Jane's words sank in. Her friend had been carrying this burden alone, fighting against forces she barely understood. And in the end, it had cost her her life. But what did it all mean? The cycle, the 17 souls, the mysterious door. How did it all connect to the Douglas massacre and the present-day horrors unfolding at the school? A soft knock at her door made Laurel jump. She quickly wiped her eyes and hid the journal under her pillow before calling out, "Who is it? It's Ian," came the muffled reply. "Laurel, we need to talk. It's about what happened in the chapel last night." Laurel hesitated, Jane's warnings about trusting no one echoing in her mind. But if anyone might have answers, it would be Ian. He had been close to Jane in those final weeks. "Come in," she said, steeling herself. Ian entered, his face grave. He looked like he hadn't slept, his usually neat appearance dishevelled. "I assume you've read the journal," he said without preamble. Laurel nodded, too overwhelmed to be surprised that he knew about it. Ian sank into the chair by her desk, suddenly looking very old and very tired. "Then you understand the danger we're all in. The cycle is beginning again, Laurel, and I fear we may already be too late to stop it." "What cycle?" Laurel demanded, her voice hoarse. "What's really going on here, Ian? What happened to Jane?" Ian's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "It's a long story, Laurel, one that goes back over a century, to the very founding of this school. But if we're going to have any hope of preventing more deaths, you need to know everything." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What do you know about Ambrose Douglas, the founder of this academy?" Laurel shook her head, confused by the apparent change of subject. "Not much. Just what's in the official histories." Ian's laugh was bitter. "The official histories, if only they knew." He took a deep breath. "Ambrose Douglas was more than just an educator, Laurel. He was an occultist, obsessed with the idea of bridging the gap between the living and the dead. And in 1891 he succeeded. But the price, the price was higher than anyone could have imagined. A chill ran down Laurel's spine as the pieces began to fall into place. "The Douglas massacre," she whispered. Ian nodded grimly. 17 students and 3 teachers sacrificed in a ritual gone horribly wrong. But it didn't end there. The barrier between worlds had been weakened, and something came through. Something that has haunted this school ever since, demanding a fresh sacrifice every generation to maintain its hold on our world. Laurel felt sick. And Jane discovered all this. She did more than discover it, Laurel. She was chosen. Just as you have been chosen now. Before Laurel could process this bombshell, a scream echoed through the halls of Douglas Academy. Then another. And another. Ian stood, his face pale. "It's happening again, we're out of time." As if in response to his words, the lights in Laurel's room flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the corner, a woman in black, her face hidden in shadow, one arm outstretched as if in invitation. And there, appearing in the air before the spectral figure, was a door. A door that seemed to be made of pure darkness, slowly creaking open. The woman's voice, eerily familiar, whispered in Laurel's mind, "The door is open, Laurel Snow. The choice is yours. Step through and face the truth, or watch as 17 more souls pay the price for a century-old sin."
As Laurel stared at the impossible door, Jane's final words echoed in her memory, "Lux in tenebris."
Light in darkness. With a deep breath, knowing that her decision would change everything, Laurel stepped forward into the unknown. Chapter 9, Sleepwalking. Laurel's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. The last thing she recalled was stepping towards that impossible door of darkness in her room, Ian's warnings echoing in her ears. But now she was standing in the middle of a corridor she didn't recognize, the cold stone of the floor seeping through her bare feet. Moonlight filtered through tall, arched windows, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist at the edges of her vision. "Hello!" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. It echoed unnaturally in the empty hallway, coming back to her distorted and wrong. How did I get here? Laurel wondered, a chill running down her spine. Was I sleepwalking? She took a hesitant step forward, and then another. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the shadows growing deeper with each step. As she walked, Laurel became aware of a soft, rhythmic sound. It took her a moment to realize what it was, the ticking of a clock, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly, a figure darted across the far end of the corridor, a flash of white in the darkness. Laurel's breath caught in her throat. "Wait!" she called out, breaking into a run. But as she reached the intersection where she'd seen the figure, she found only more empty corridors branching off in different directions. The ticking grew louder, more insistent, and now there was something else underneath it, whispers, too faint to make out the words, but growing in volume with each passing second. Laurel spun around, trying to locate the source of the sounds. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Show yourself." In response, all the whispers ceased at once, leaving only the relentless ticking. And then a single voice cut through the silence. "Tick-tock, Laurel Snow. Time is running out. 17 souls to pay the price. How many have fallen already? How many more will you let die before you face the truth?" The voice was Jane's, but distorted, as if coming from underwater or perhaps from very far away. "Jane!" Laurel called out, her voice breaking. "Jane, where are you?" A chilling laugh echoed through the corridor. "Not Jane, not anymore. But soon, Laurel. Soon you'll understand. The door is waiting. All you have to do is step through." The shadows at the edges of Laurel's vision began to coalesce, taking on vaguely human shapes. They reached for her with wispy, insubstantial hands, their touch like ice on her skin. Laurel ran. She tore through the twisting corridors of Douglas Academy, the otherworldly laughter and the relentless ticking of the clock following close behind. Left, right, up a flight of stairs, down another, she quickly lost all sense of direction. The shadows pursued her, always just a step behind, their whispers growing more frantic, more hungry. And then, suddenly, Laurel found herself in a familiar place, the far quad, a secluded courtyard at the heart of the school. Moonlight bathed the ancient stones in an eerie glow, and in the centre stood a solitary figure. "Brett?" Laurel gasped, stumbling to a halt. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Laurel, what are you doing out here?" Before she could respond, a scream pierced the night, high and terrified and horrifyingly familiar. "Jane," Laurel whispered, her blood running cold. Brett's eyes widened in fear. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, it can't be. She's dead, Laurel. We both know she's dead." But the scream came again, closer this time, and with it the sound of running footsteps. "We have to help her," Laurel cried, moving towards the sound. But Brett grabbed her arm, holding her back. "Laurel, wait. This isn't real. It can't be real. We're dreaming or something worse." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and gasped. Brett's face was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and his eyes were pitch black, like two holes cut into the fabric of reality. "Brett," Laurel whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled, and it was a terrible thing to behold. "Not quite," he said, his voice overlaid with others, dozens, hundreds of voices speaking in unison. "But close enough for now." Laurel tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. The shadows that had been chasing her swarmed around them, taking on more defined shapes. Faces began to emerge from the darkness. Young faces, old faces, all of them twisted in expressions of agony and rage. "Do you see them, Laurel?" Not Brett asked, his voice almost gentle. "The 17, and all those who came after. Generation after generation, feeding the hunger, maintaining the balance. But it's never enough. It's never enough. What do you want from me?" Laurel demanded, tears streaming down her face. The thing wearing Brett's face leaned in close, its breath like the chill of the grave against her cheek. "We want you to wake up, Laurel Snow. We want you to open your eyes and see the truth. The door is waiting. The choice is yours." And then, with a force that felt like being hit by a truck, Laurel was thrown backwards. She fell and fell and fell, the world spinning around her in a kaleidoscope of shadow and moonlight. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. For a moment she lay there gasping, afraid to open her eyes. "Laurel. Oh my God, Laurel, are you all right?" Slowly, hesitantly, she opened her eyes. She was lying on the floor of the main hall, a small crowd of students and faculty gathered around her. And kneeling beside her, his face etched with concern, was Brett, the real Brett, his eyes normal and human. "What? What happened?" Laurel managed, her throat dry and raw as if she'd been screaming. "You were sleepwalking," Brett explained, helping her to sit up. "We found you wandering the halls, talking to yourself. When we tried to wake you, you just collapsed." Laurel looked around, taking in the worried faces surrounding her. Sunlight streamed through the windows. It was morning. Just a dream then. Just a terrible, vivid nightmare. But as her gaze swept the crowd, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, at the back of the group, stood a familiar figure, a woman in a black dress, her face hidden in shadow. And as Laurel watched, unable to look away, the woman raised a finger to her lips in a gesture of silence before fading away into nothing. "Laurel." Brett's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Laurel, what is it? What do you see?" She turned back to him, her mind reeling. "Nothing," she lied, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Just a bad dream." But as Brett helped her to her feet, and the crowd began to disperse, Laurel couldn't shake the feeling that she was still dreaming. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred, and somewhere in the shadows of Douglas Academy, a door was waiting. A door that, sooner or later, she would have to step through. As if in response to her thoughts, a distant clock began to chime. Laurel counted the strokes, her heart sinking with each one. 17. Time was running out. Chapter 10, the alumni auction. The grand ballroom of Douglas Academy glittered with false cheer, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light over the assembled crowd. Laurel stood at the edge of the room, a flute of champagne clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She had barely slept since her sleepwalking episode, dark circles under her eyes carefully concealed with makeup. The annual alumni auction was in full swing, a cacophony of laughter, clinking glasses, and the auctioneer's rapid-fire patter filling the air. But beneath it all, Laurel could sense an undercurrent of tension, as if the very walls of Douglas were holding their breath, waiting. "Laurel Snow, as I live and breathe." She turned to see Robin Miller approaching, resplendent in a designer gown that sparkled almost as brightly as her forced smile. Robin had been 2 years ahead of Laurel at Douglas and had gone on to become a best-selling author in her own right. "Robin," Laurel greeted her, pasting on a smile of her own. "It's been too long, hasn't it just?" Robin air-kissed Laurel's cheeks. "I was thrilled to hear you'd taken the writer-in-residence position. It's so important to give back to our alma mater, don't you think?" Before Laurel could respond, Robin leaned in close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Though between you and me, I'm not sure I could spend more than a night in this place. Too many memories." A chill ran down Laurel's spine. "What do you mean?" Robin's eyes darted around the room before settling back on Laurel. "Oh, you know. The things we all experienced here. The ghostly encounters, the strange noises in the night. Just old building quirks, I'm sure, but She trailed off, taking a large sip of champagne. Laurel was about to press further when a commotion near the auction stage caught her attention. Headmaster Ramsay was there, engaged in what looked like a heated discussion with an elderly man Laurel didn't recognize. "If you'll excuse me," she murmured to Robin, already moving towards the stage. As she drew closer, snippets of the conversation became audible. "See, and not possibly auction that off," the old man was saying, his voice quavering with age and emotion. "Do you have any idea what it could unleash?" Headmaster Ramsay's response was too low to hear, but his expression was a mixture of anger and fear. As Laurel approached, both men fell silent, turning to look at her with identical expressions of wariness. "Miss Snow," Ramsay said, his tone carefully neutral, "are you enjoying the auction?" "It's lovely," Laurel replied, her gaze moving between the two men. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is there a problem with one of the auction items?" The elderly man opened his mouth as if to speak, but Ramsay cut him off. "Not at all. Mr. Courtney here was just expressing some sentimental attachment to one of the pieces, but I've assured him that it will be going to a good home." Laurel's heart skipped a beat. "Courtney? Could this be Jane's grandfather?" "Mr. Courtney," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Laurel Snow. I was a friend of Jane's." The old man's rheumy eyes widened in recognition. He took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "My dear," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've heard so much about you. Jane, she spoke of you often." Ramsay cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, I'm sure you two have much to discuss. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on the next lot." As he hurried away, Mr. Courtney turned to Laurel, his expression grave. "We shouldn't talk here," he said quietly. "Too many years. Meet me in the library in 10 minutes. There are things you need to know." Before Laurel could respond, he melted into the crowd, leaving her standing alone with more questions than ever. The next 10 minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Laurel made a show of examining the auction items, her mind racing. What could Jane's grandfather know, and what was the item he was so desperate to keep out of the auction? Finally, she managed to slip away from the ballroom, making her way through the quiet corridors to the library. The large room was dark and silent, the only light coming from the moon shining through the high windows. "Mr. Courtney," Laurel called softly, moving between the towering bookshelves. "Here, child." She found him in a secluded alcove, seated in a high-backed leather chair. In his lap was a small, ornate box. "I'm glad you came," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "We don't have much time." Laurel perched on the edge of a nearby chair, her heart pounding. "What's going on, Mr. Courtney? What do you know about Jane's death?" The old man sighed heavily, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns on the box. "I know that it wasn't suicide," he said quietly. "I know that my granddaughter was involved in something dark, something that goes back to the very founding of this school. And I know that by keeping silent all these years, I've only allowed the cycle to continue." He opened the box, revealing an old, leather-bound journal. "This was Jane's," he said, holding it out to Laurel. "Her real journal, not the sanitized version the school released after her death. I've kept it hidden all these years, too afraid of what it might unleash if the truth came to light. But now I fear the consequences of silence may be even worse." Laurel took the journal with trembling hands. "Why are you giving this to me now?" Mr. Courtney leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Because history is repeating itself, Miss Snow. The signs are all there, the strange occurrences, the whispers in the night. It's happening again, just as it did in Jane's time and in my time before that. The cycle is nearing its end, and unless someone breaks it, more will die." A chill ran down Laurel's spine. "The Douglas massacre," she whispered. The old man nodded grimly. "You've heard of it, then? Good. That's a start, but there's so much more you need to know. The massacre was just the beginning. Every 17 years since then, the debt comes due. 17 souls to feed the hunger. And one to bear witness, to carry the burden to the next generation." "Jane," Laurel said, realization dawning. She was the witness. "Yes," Mr. Courtney replied, his voice breaking. "And now I fear that burden has passed to you." Before Laurel could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the ballroom. Screams and the sound of breaking glass echoed through the corridors. Mr. Courtney stood, his face pale. "It's starting," he said. "We're out of time." Laurel clutched the journal to her chest, her mind reeling. "What do I do?" The old man gripped her shoulders, his eyes boring into hers. "Read the journal. Find the door. And whatever you do, don't let them complete the ritual. The price is too high, do you understand?" Laurel nodded, even though she didn't understand at all. Suddenly the temperature in the room plummeted. Laurel's breath came out in a visible cloud, and the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to move with a life of their own. "Go," Mr. Courtney urged, pushing her towards the door. "Go now." As Laurel ran from the library, Jane's journal clutched tightly to her chest. She glanced back. What she saw made her blood run cold. A figure stood behind Mr. Courtney, a woman in a black dress, her face hidden in shadow. As Laurel watched, frozen in horror, the figure reached out, placing a hand on the old man's shoulder. Mr. Courtney's eyes met Laurel's one last time, filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. And then, in the blink of an eye, both he and the shadowy woman vanished, leaving nothing behind but a whisper that seemed to echo through the very walls of Douglas Academy. "The door is opening, Laurel Snow. The choice is yours. Step through and face the truth, or watch as 17 more souls pay the price for a century-old sin." The screams from the ballroom grew louder. Clutching Jane's journal like a talisman, Laurel ran towards the sound, knowing that whatever horrors awaited her there, they were only the beginning. The cycle was nearing its end, and Laurel Snow, whether she was ready or not, found herself at the center of a storm that had been brewing for over a century. Chapter 11. Courtney's Arrival. The aftermath of the alumni auction hung over Douglas Academy like a shroud. Whispered rumors of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena circulated among the students, growing more outlandish with each retelling. Laurel, her mind still reeling from her encounter with Mr. Courtney and the mysterious disappearance that followed, found herself struggling to separate fact from fiction, reality from the increasingly surreal world she found herself inhabiting. It was in this atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that Courtney Harris arrived at Douglas Academy. Laurel first saw her in the crowded hallway between classes. The new girl stood out immediately, not just because of her unfamiliarity, but because of the way the other students seemed to part around her, creating a bubble of hushed whispers and sidelong glances. As Courtney turned, her gaze sweeping the corridor, Laurel felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. The face that looked back at her was hauntingly, impossibly familiar. It was as if Jane herself had stepped out of Laurel's memories and into the present day. "Laurel!" Brett's voice snapped her back to reality. He had appeared at her side, his face pale. "Do you see her? Tell me you see her too." Laurel nodded, unable to form words. Together they watched as Courtney made her way down the hall, the crowd of students parting before her like the Red Sea. "Who is she?" Laurel finally managed to ask. Brett shook his head, his eyes never leaving Courtney's retreating form. "New student, Courtney Harris. She just transferred in. But Laurel, how is this possible? She looks exactly like—" "I know," Laurel cut him off. "We need to talk to her." But before they could move, Headmaster Ramsey appeared, placing a hand on Courtney's shoulder and steering her towards his office. As they passed, Ramsey's eyes met Laurel's, and the warning in them was clear. "Stay away." The rest of the day passed in a blur for Laurel. She went through the motions of teaching her classes, but her mind was consumed with thoughts of Courtney Harris and her uncanny resemblance to Jane. It couldn't be a coincidence, not with everything else that was happening at Douglas. As the final bell rang, Laurel made her way to the faculty lounge, hoping to catch a moment alone to gather her thoughts. But as she pushed open the door, she found the room already occupied. Ian Blackwood sat in one of the overstuffed armchairs, his face ashen. Across from him, perched on the edge of the sofa, was Courtney Harris. "Miss Snow," Ian said, his voice strained, "please, join us. I was just getting to know our new student." Laurel entered the room slowly, her eyes never leaving Courtney's face. Up close, the resemblance to Jane was even more striking. It was as if someone had reached into Laurel's memories and pulled Jane out, whole and unchanged by the passage of time. "It's nice to meet you, Miss Snow," Courtney said, her voice soft and eerily familiar. "I've heard so much about you." Laurel sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "Have you?" she managed. "And what have you heard?" A small smile played at the corners of Courtney's mouth.
"Oh, you know that you're a famous author."
"That you used to be a student here. That you were best friends with a girl who died under mysterious circumstances." The bluntness of her words hung in the air like a challenge. Ian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Laurel met Courtney's gaze head-on. "You look very much like her," Laurel said quietly. "My friend who died. Has anyone told you that?" Courtney's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Once or twice. It's a strange coincidence, isn't it?" "I don't believe in coincidences," Laurel replied. "Not anymore." "Not here." A tense silence fell over the room. Ian cleared his throat, clearly eager to change the subject. "Courtney, why don't you tell Miss Snow a bit about why you transferred to Douglas?" Courtney leaned back, her posture relaxed, but her eyes never leaving Laurel's face. "My parents thought it would be good for me to have a change of scenery. They said Douglas Academy had a unique atmosphere, that it might help me find myself." "And have you," Laurel asked, "found yourself?" Something flickered in Courtney's eyes, a flash of something old and knowing that had no place in a teenage girl's gaze. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm closer than I've ever been." Before Laurel could respond, the door to the faculty lounge burst open. Brett stood there, his face flushed, clutching a stack of old yearbooks. "Laurel, you need to see this," he said, his voice urgent. Then his eyes fell on Courtney, and he froze. Courtney stood, smoothing down her uniform skirt. "I should go," she said. "It was lovely meeting you both. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other." As she moved towards the door, she paused next to Brett. For a moment they stared at each other, an unspoken current of recognition passing between them. Then Courtney was gone, the click of her shoes echoing down the hallway. Brett stumbled into the room, dropping the yearbooks on the coffee table. "You saw her?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Tell me you saw her too." Laurel nodded, her mind racing. "We saw her, Brett. What's in the yearbooks?" With trembling hands, Brett opened one of the books, flipping to a marked page. There, staring out from a black-and-white photograph, was a face identical to Courtney's. The caption read, "Jane Courtney, class of 1972. "That's impossible," Ian whispered, leaning in for a closer look. "That would make her Jane's mother," Laurel finished. She turned to the next marked page, and there was the face again. "Sarah Courtney, class of 1955. Another page, another identical face. Elizabeth Courtney, class of 1938. Brett's voice was barely audible. "It goes back further, all the way to the founding of the school. Every 17 years, like clockwork. Always a Courtney, always with that face." Laurel's mind whirled, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The cycle Mr. Courtney had spoken of, the 17-year intervals, the debt that had to be paid. "It's not just a resemblance," she said slowly. "It's the same person. Somehow, impossibly, it's always been the same person." A chill swept through the room, causing the lights to flicker. In the momentary darkness, Laurel could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the corner, a woman in a black dress, her face hidden in shadow. When the lights stabilized, the figure was gone, but a voice, whispers soft and achingly familiar, seemed to linger in the air. "The past and present are merging, Laurel. The veil is thinning. Find the door before it's too late." Laurel stood, her decision made. "We need to talk to Courtney again. Now." Whatever's happening, whatever this cycle is, I think she's at the center of it. As they hurried from the faculty lounge, none of them noticed the small leather-bound book that had appeared on the coffee table. Its cover was worn and faded, but the title was still legible: The Courtney Curse, A History of Douglas Academy's Darkest Secret. The door to the truth was opening, and Laurel Snow, for better or worse, was about to step through. Chapter 12. The Seance. The old chapel stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, its Gothic spires reaching towards the gathering storm clouds like grasping fingers. Laurel hesitated at the entrance, a shiver running down her spine that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. "Miss Snow, are you coming?" Laurel turned to see Emily, one of her most promising writing students, peering at her with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Behind Emily, a small group of students huddled together, whispering and casting furtive glances at the chapel. "I'm still not sure this is a good idea," Laurel said, her voice low. "Seances aren't something to be taken lightly, especially not here." Emily's eyes sparkled with a combination of fear and thrill. "But that's why we need you, Miss Snow. You knew Jane. If anyone can make contact, it's you." Laurel suppressed a sigh. She had agreed to supervise this séance partly out of concern for the students' safety and partly out of a desperate hope that it might provide some answers. But now, standing in the shadow of the chapel where Jane had died, where so much blood had been spilled over the years, she felt a deep sense of foreboding. "All right," she said finally, "but we follow the rules. No one leaves the circle, no matter what happens. Understood?" The students nodded solemnly, and together they entered the chapel. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of dust and old incense. Flickering candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, their light reflecting off the stained glass windows and creating an otherworldly atmosphere. In the centre of the nave, a circular table had been set up, surrounded by chairs. As they took their seats, Laurel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her eyes kept darting to the darkened corners of the chapel, half expecting to see the woman in black materialize from the shadows. Emily placed an old Ouija board in the centre of the table. "I found this in one of the storage rooms," she explained. "It looks like it's been here for decades." Laurel examined the board closely. Its wood was dark with age, the letters and symbols etched deeply into its surface. Something about it made her skin crawl, but she couldn't put her finger on why. "Remember," she cautioned as the students placed their fingers lightly on the planchette, "we're here to observe, not to interfere. If anything feels wrong, we stop immediately." A hush fell over the group as Emily began the séance. "We call upon the spirits of Douglas Academy," she intoned, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "We seek to communicate with those who have passed beyond the veil. If there are any spirits present, please make yourself known." For a long moment, nothing happened. The candles flickered, casting writhing shadows on the walls. Laurel was just beginning to relax when suddenly a cold breeze swept through the chapel, causing the flames to gutter. The planchette beneath their fingers began to move. "Is someone pushing it?" Laurel asked sharply, but the wide-eyed looks on the students' faces told her they were as surprised as she was. Slowly, deliberately, the planchette spelled out a message, Laurel. A collective gasp went up from the students. Laurel felt her heart racing, but she forced her voice to remain calm. Is someone there? Who are we speaking to?" The planchette moved again, faster this time. Jane, Laurel's breath caught in her throat. Jane Courtney. Why, yes, the temperature in the chapel seemed to plummet. Laurel could see her breath misting in the air, and the students huddled closer together, their eyes wide with fear and excitement. "Jane," Laurel said, her voice trembling slightly, "what happened to you? What's going on at Douglas?" The planchette flew across the board, spelling out words so quickly they could barely keep up. DOOROPENCYCLEENDING. Door. Cycle ending. Emily read aloud, her voice quavering. What does that mean? Before Laurel could respond, the planchette moved again, SEVENTEN, and then with a force that made them all jerk back. It spelled out RUN, a bone-chilling scream echoed through the chapel, causing the students to cry out in terror. The candles flared impossibly high, then extinguished all at once, plunging them into darkness. "Nobody move!" Laurel shouted over the panicked cries of the students, "Stay in the circle." But even as she spoke, she felt an icy touch on her shoulder. A voice, achingly familiar yet distorted by something inhuman, whispered in her ear, "The door is open, Laurel. They're coming through. You have to stop it before it's too late." A flash of lightning illuminated the chapel for a split second, and in that moment Laurel saw her. Jane stood at the altar, but not as Laurel remembered her. This Jane was pale and translucent, her eyes dark pits of shadow. Behind her, barely visible, were other figures, dozens of them, their faces twisted in expressions of agony and rage. And there, in the centre of it all, stood Courtney Harris, her eyes glowing with an unearthly light. The lightning faded, plunging them back into darkness. The students were screaming now, their earlier excitement replaced by genuine terror. Laurel felt the icy presence release her, and she stumbled to her feet. "Everyone out!" she yelled, groping in the dark for the students. Now, they scrambled for the exit, tripping over pews and each other in their haste to escape. As Laurel herded the last student out, she glanced back one final time. The chapel was illuminated by a soft, pulsing glow. In the centre of the nave, where their table had been, now stood a door. It was made of shadows and mist, its edges blurred and indistinct, and it was opening, ever so slowly. Courtney stood before it, her hand outstretched as if in welcome. As Laurel watched, frozen in horror, Courtney turned to look at her. Her face shifted, flickering between her own features and Jane's and others' faces Laurel recognized from the yearbook photos, all the Courtneys throughout the years. "It's time, Laurel," Courtney said, her voice a chorus of many. "The cycle is ending. The 17 are waiting. Will you join us?" A gust of wind slammed the chapel door shut, breaking the spell. Laurel found herself outside, surrounded by the shaken students. In the distance she could hear shouts and running footsteps, the faculty, no doubt, coming to investigate the commotion. As Laurel tried to catch her breath, tried to make sense of what she had just witnessed, Emily tugged at her sleeve. The girl's face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Miss Snow," she whispered, holding out her hand. "Look." In Emily's palm lay the planchette from the Ouija board, and etched into its surface, as if burned there by some otherworldly force, were two words: "Save us, the storm broke overhead, rain pouring down in sheets." But even as the water soaked her to the skin, Laurel couldn't shake the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The door in the dark was opening, and whatever lay on the other side was pushing its way into their world. The 17 were waiting, and Laurel Snow, whether she was ready or not, would have to face them. Chapter 13. Confronting the Headmaster. The morning after the séance, Laurel stood outside Headmaster Ramsey's office, her hand poised to knock. The events of the previous night swirled in her mind: the moving planchette, Jane's spectral appearance, the mysterious door, and Courtney's enigmatic role in it all. She had spent a sleepless night poring over Jane's journal, connecting dots and forming theories, each more outlandish than the last. But one thing was clear: the headmaster knew more than he was letting on, and Laurel was done with half-truths and evasions. She knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. "Come in," Ramsey's voice called from within. Laurel entered, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt oddly final. The headmaster's office was a study in carefully curated academia, leather-bound books lining the walls, a massive antique desk dominating the space, and various awards and accolades displayed prominently. Ramsey himself sat behind the desk, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression a mask of polite inquiry. "Miss Snow," he said, gesturing to a chair. To what do I owe the pleasure? Laurel remained standing. I think you know why I'm here, Headmaster. It's time we talked about Jane. A flicker of something. Fear. Anger. Passed across Ramsay's face before his neutral expression reasserted itself. Jane Courtney's death was a tragedy, Miss Snow. One that affected us all deeply. But I'm not sure what more there is to discuss after all these years. How about the truth? Laurel shot back. She placed Jane's journal on the desk between them. I know about the cover-up. I know Jane's death wasn't a simple suicide. And I know it's connected to something much older and darker at the heart of this school. Ramsay's eyes fixed on the journal, his face paling slightly. Where did you get that? Does it matter? What matters is what's in it. The cycle, the 17, the door in the dark. Jane knew about all of it. And so do you. For a long moment, silence reigned in the office. Then, with a heavy sigh, Ramsay seemed to deflate. He suddenly looked older, wearier. Sit down, Laurel. Please. She hesitated, then took a seat, her eyes never leaving the headmaster's face. Ramsay opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a bottle of scotch and 2 glasses. He poured a generous measure into each, sliding one across to Laurel. She left it untouched. What do you know about the founding of Douglas Academy? Ramsay asked, taking a long sip from his glass. Laurel frowned. Ambrose Douglas established it in 1823. It was one of the first CO educational institutions in the country. Ramsay nodded. That's the official history. But there's more to it. Ambrose Douglas wasn't just an educator. He was an occultist, obsessed with bridging the gap between the living and the dead. A chill ran down Laurel's spine as she remembered Ian's words from what felt like a lifetime ago. The Douglas massacre, she whispered. Yes, Ramsay confirmed, his voice heavy. In 1891, Douglas attempted a ritual. He believed he could open a door to the other side, to harness the power of the dead for the benefit of the living. But something went wrong. 17 students and 3 teachers died that night. But it didn't end there, did it? Laurel pressed. Ramsay shook his head. No, the door Douglas opened. It couldn't be fully closed. Every 17 years the veil between worlds thins, and the debt must be paid. 17 souls, Laurel said, the pieces falling into place, to keep whatever came through at bay. To maintain the balance, Ramsay corrected, to prevent something far worse from breaking through. Laurel felt sick. And Jane, where does she fit into all this? Ramsay's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of guilt and resolve. Jane was special, like her mother before her and her grandmother before that, the Courtney women. They've always had a connection to the other side. They serve as a bridge, an anchor for the ritual. That's why Courtney Harris is here now, Laurel realized. She's the next in line. Ramsay nodded. We didn't want to involve you, Laurel. We hoped that with Jane gone, the cycle might be broken. But it's clear now that was wishful thinking. Anger flared in Laurel's chest. So you just covered it all up. Let everyone believe Jane killed herself. Do you have any idea what that did to her family, her friends? We did what we had to do to protect the school, to protect everyone, Ramsay snapped. Then, more softly, to protect you. Laurel stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't need your protection. I need the truth. All of it. Ramsay's gaze fell on Jane's journal. The truth is in there, I suspect. Jane always was too clever for her own good. But Laurel, be careful. Knowledge comes at a price, especially here. A price I'm willing to pay, Laurel said firmly. No more secrets, no more lies. Whatever's coming, whatever this cycle is leading to, I'm going to stop it. For Jane, for all of them. As she turned to leave, Ramsay called out, Laurel, the door. It's not just a metaphor. When the time comes, you'll have to make a choice, and that choice will determine everything. Laurel paused at the threshold, looking back at the man who had been more than just a headmaster to her all those years ago. "I already have," she said quietly. She left the office, her mind reeling with revelations but her purpose clearer than ever. As she walked down the corridor, she barely noticed the whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls, or the shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. Laurel made her way to her room, locking the door behind her. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began to write. The words poured out of her, a torrent of truth and speculation, weaving together the threads of a century-old mystery. Hours passed, the light outside fading from day to dusk to full dark. Laurel wrote on, barely aware of the passage of time. Her usual careful prose had given way to something raw, more urgent. It was as if she was channeling not just her own voice, but the voices of all those who had been silenced over the years. As she typed the final words, a gust of wind swept through the room, ruffling the pages of Jane's journal where it lay open on the bed. Laurel looked up, her eyes falling on the mirror above her dresser. For a moment, just a heartbeat, she saw not her own reflection, but Jane's. Her friend smiled sadly, raising a hand as if in farewell. And then she was gone, leaving Laurel alone with the weight of newfound knowledge and the certainty that the final confrontation was drawing near. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and somewhere in the depths of Douglas Academy, a door was waiting to be opened. Chapter 14. The Hidden Child. Laurel's fingers trembled as she turned the brittle pages of Jane's journal. After her confrontation with Headmaster Ramsay, she had retreated to her room, determined to comb through every word Jane had written, searching for any clue she might have missed. As the night deepened, her eyes burning from strain and lack of sleep, Laurel found something that made her blood run cold. Tucked between two pages, almost invisible, was a small folded piece of paper. With bated breath, Laurel carefully unfolded it. It was a hospital bracelet, the kind given to newborns. The name was smudged, but the date was clear, October 12th, the day before Jane died. "Oh, Jane," Laurel whispered, her voice breaking. "What were you hiding?" The implications were staggering. If Jane had given birth just before her death, where was the child now? And how did this fit into the dark cycle that seemed to govern Douglas Academy? With shaking hands, Laurel reached for her phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. "Jimmy, it's me. I need your help." Hours later, Laurel found herself in the dusty back room of the county records office, surrounded by stacks of files and microfiche reels. Jimmy, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, looked up from the computer she was hunched over. "Law, are you sure about this? It's been 15 years. Even if there was a child, the trail's probably cold by now." Laurel shook her head, determination etched on her face. "It can't be. This is too important. The child. Jimmy, I think it might be the key to everything that's happening at Douglas." Jimmy sighed but turned back to her screen. "All right. I've got access to the sealed adoption records from that year. Give me a few more minutes." As Jimmy worked, Laurel paced the small room, her mind racing. If Jane had a child, who was the father? Why had she kept it a secret? And most pressingly, what had happened to the baby after Jane's death? "Wait," Jimmy said suddenly, her voice tense. "I think I've found something. An adoption finalized just days after Jane died. The birth mother's name is redacted, but the date of birth matches." Laurel rushed to look over Jimmy's shoulder. "What about the adoptive parents?" "Is there a name?" Jimmy scrolled through the document, her frown deepening. "That's weird. The adoptive parents' names are blacked out too. But look at this, the agency that handled the adoption. Ring any bells?" Laurel leaned in, her eyes widening as she read the name. "Courtney Family Services." "Jimmy, that has to be connected to Jane's family. Her grandfather. He must have arranged it. But why?" Jimmy asked. "Why go to all this trouble to hide the child's existence?" Before Laurel could respond, a noise from the hallway made them both freeze. Footsteps. heavy and purposeful, were approaching the records room. "Quick," Laurel hissed. "Save what you can. We need to go." Jimmy hurriedly copied files to a USB drive while Laurel gathered their things. Just as the door began to open, they slipped out through a back exit, hearts pounding. As they hurried down the street, Laurel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of a figure in a black coat duck into an alley. "We need to split up," Laurel said, her voice low. "Jimmy, take the files, get them somewhere safe. I'll meet you later." Jimmy nodded, fear and concern warring in her eyes. "Laurel, be careful. Whatever this is, it's bigger than we thought." With a quick hug, they parted ways. Laurel headed towards Douglas Academy, her mind whirling with possibilities. As she approached the imposing gates, a figure stepped out of the shadows, making her jump. "Miss Snow," Brett said, his voice tight with tension. "We need to talk." Laurel studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the haunted look she recognized all too well. "What is it, Brett? What do you know?" He glanced around nervously before leaning in close. "It's about Jane's child. First, I think I know where they are." Laurel's heart leapt into her throat. "How, Brett? What aren't you telling me?" Before he could answer, a scream echoed across the campus. They both turned to see a group of students pointing at one of the upper windows of the main building. There, clearly visible in the moonlight, was a figure in an old-fashioned Douglas uniform, her long dark hair streaming behind her as she pressed her hands against the glass. "Jane," Laurel whispered. As they watched, transfixed, the figure turned to look directly at them. And in that moment, Laurel knew with bone-deep certainty that it wasn't Jane at all. It was Courtney Harris. The pieces began to fall into place with dizzying speed. Courtney's uncanny resemblance to Jane, her strange behavior, the way she seemed to know things she shouldn't. "Oh, my God!" Laurel breathed, realization dawning. Courtney isn't just connected to Jane, she is Jane's child. Brett's sharp intake of breath confirmed her suspicion. "How did you?" But Laurel was already moving, racing towards the building. She could hear Brett calling after her, but she didn't slow down. If Courtney was Jane's daughter, if she was the next in the Courtney line, then she was in terrible danger. As Laurel burst through the main doors, the air around her seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening in impossible ways. The whispers that had been haunting the edges of her consciousness grew louder, more insistent. "The door is opening, Laurel," they seemed to say. "The cycle is nearing its end. Will you save her, or will you let history repeat itself?" Laurel took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to reach Courtney before it was too late, before whatever dark force that had claimed Jane could take her daughter too. As she rounded the corner to the hallway where she had seen Courtney, Laurel skidded to a halt. The corridor stretched before her, impossibly long and dark. And at the far end stood a door that shouldn't exist, made of shadows and mist, slowly creaking open. Courtney stood before it, her hand outstretched, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Courtney!" Laurel called out, her voice echoing strangely in the warped space. You don't know what you're doing." Courtney turned, and Laurel gasped. For a moment she saw not the young student but Jane as she had been 15 years ago, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Laurel," Courtney said, her voice a blend of her own and Jane's. "I'm finishing what my mother started. I'm breaking the cycle." And with that, she stepped through the door. Laurel lunged forward, but the door was already closing. In the split second before it vanished entirely, she caught a glimpse of what lay beyond, a swirling vortex of memories and lost souls, at the center of which stood a familiar figure in black, arms outstretched in welcome. Then the door was gone, leaving Laurel alone in a suddenly normal hallway, the echo of Courtney's last words hanging in the air. Behind her, she heard Brett's ragged breathing as he finally caught up. "Laurel," he panted, "what happened?" "Where's Courtney?" Laurel turned to him, her face set with grim determination. She's gone through, and we're going to get her back." As if in response to her words, the lights in the hallway flickered and a chill wind swept through the corridor. The hunt for Jane's hidden child had led Laurel to a truth more fantastic and terrifying than she could have imagined. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The door in the dark had opened, and Laurel Snow was ready to step through, no matter the cost. Chapter 15, Ian's Redemption. The soft glow of a desk lamp cast long shadows across Ian Blackwood's office as Laurel burst through the door, Brett close on her heels. Ian looked up from the papers he'd been poring over, his face a mask of exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of long-buried guilt. "Laurel," he said, his voice rough, "I've been expecting you." "You knew," Laurel accused, her words sharp with anger and fear. "You knew about Courtney. About Jane's child. Why didn't you tell me?" Ian sighed heavily, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's complicated. Please, sit down, both of you. It's time you knew the whole truth." Laurel hesitated, then sank into one of the chairs facing Ian's desk. Brett remained standing, his posture tense, ready for action. "Start talking," Laurel demanded. Ian nodded, reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a worn leather journal, not Jane's, Laurel realized, but his own. "I've been keeping this for 15 years, he said softly. "A record of everything that happened, everything I knew and suspected. I thought if I could just make sense of it all, maybe I could find a way to make things right." He opened the journal, his fingers trembling slightly. "Jane came to me about 2 months before she died. She was scared, confused. She told me she'd been having dreams, terrible visions of past tragedies at Douglas, of a cycle of death that had been repeating for over a century." Laurel leaned forward, her anger giving way to intense curiosity. "The Douglas massacre," she said. "The 17 souls." Ian nodded. "Yes, but it was more than that. Jane. She could see the connections, the patterns that no one else could. She realized that her family, the Courtney women, had been at the center of it all, generation after generation." "But why?" Brett interjected. "What made the Courtneys so special?" Ian's gaze grew distant, as if seeing something far beyond the confines of his office. "The Courtney bloodline has always had a sensitivity to the other side. They serve as a bridge between worlds. A focal point for the energies that Ambrose Douglas unleashed all those years ago." Laurel felt a chill run down her spine. "And Jane, what happened to her?" Ian's face crumpled with grief and guilt. "She discovered she was pregnant. The father. Well, that doesn't matter now. What matters is that Jane realized her child would be the next in the Courtney line. She was determined to break the cycle, to end it once and for all. But she died," Laurel said softly. "She died and the cycle continued." Ian nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I tried to help her. We researched ancient rituals, occult practices, anything that might provide a solution. But in the end..." He trailed off, his voice breaking. "In the end, what?" Brett pressed. Ian took a shuddering breath. "In the end, Jane decided the only way to break the cycle was to sacrifice herself. She believed that by dying at the right moment, in the right way, she could create a sort of fire break, a barrier that would protect her child and end the cycle for good." Laurel felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. "But it didn't work," she whispered. "No," Ian confirmed. "It didn't, or at least not entirely. The cycle was disrupted but not broken, and now, 15 years later, it's starting again," Brett finished. "With Courtney." Ian nodded grimly. "Precisely, and if we don't find a way to stop it, the consequences will be catastrophic." Laurel's mind was reeling. "Your book," she said suddenly, "the one I accused you of plagiarizing, it wasn't based on my work at all, was it? It was Jane's story." Ian's smile was sad, tinged with regret. "Yes, I thought if I could tell her story, even in a fictionalized form, maybe it would help. Maybe someone would see the patterns, understand the truth. But I was a coward. I couldn't bring myself to tell it straight, to face the consequences of what I knew. He reached across the desk, grasping Laurel's hand. I'm so sorry, Laurel. I should have told you everything from the beginning. But I was afraid of what might happen if the truth came out, afraid of my own culpability in Jane's death. Laurel studied Ian's face, seeing the years of guilt and sorrow etched in every line. What changed? She asked softly. Why tell us now? Ian's gaze shifted to the window where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. Because time is running out. The door that Jane tried to close. It's opening again, and this time I fear there may be no way to stop it. He turned back to Laurel, his eyes blazing with a newfound determination. But you, Laurel, you might be our last hope. You have a connection to Jane, to this place that goes beyond anything I've seen before. If anyone can find a way to end this, to save Courtney and break the cycle once and for all, it's you. Laurel felt the weight of Ian's words, of Jane's legacy, settle on her shoulders. She thought of Courtney, trapped on the other side of that impossible door, of all the lives lost over the decades to a tragedy set in motion over a century ago. What do I need to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. Ian opened his journal to a page covered in intricate diagrams and arcane symbols. We need to recreate Jane's ritual, but with a crucial difference. Instead of sacrificing a life, we need to offer something else, something just as powerful but life-affirming rather than destructive. Brett, who had been silent for some time, spoke up. What could possibly be that powerful? Ian's gaze met Laurel's, and in that moment she knew. Love, she said softly. The love of a friend, the love of a mother for her child. Ian nodded. Exactly. But it won't be easy. The forces we're dealing with, they're beyond anything you can imagine. And the price of failure is unthinkable. Laurel stood, her decision made. Tell me everything you know, Ian. Every detail, every theory, every wild guess. If we're going to do this, we need to be prepared. As Ian began to explain, his voice low and urgent, Laurel could feel the air in the room changing, growing heavy with potential. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering secrets through the ancient trees of Douglas Academy. The final confrontation was coming. And Laurel Snow, armed with the truth and driven by love, was ready to face whatever lay on the other side of that door in the dark. Chapter 16. The room at the end of the hall. The corridor stretched before Laurel, shadows pooling in the corners despite the weak sunlight filtering through the dusty windows. Her footsteps echoed hollowly as she approached the door at the end of the hall, room 713, the storage room that had started it all. In her pocket, the key felt impossibly heavy. Laurel's hand trembled slightly as she fitted it into the lock, the tumblers clicking with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob, remembering Ian's warnings. Whatever you see in there, he had said, his eyes grave, remember that the past and present are merging. Trust your instincts, but don't lose sight of why you're doing this. Taking a deep breath, Laurel turned the handle and stepped into the room. At first glance, it appeared unchanged from her last visit, the narrow bed, the desk, the wardrobe. But as Laurel's eyes adjusted to the gloom, she noticed subtle differences. The air felt thicker somehow, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. And there, in the corner where the easel had stood, was a full-length mirror she didn't remember seeing before. Laurel approached it cautiously, her reflection wavering and distorting as if the glass was made of water rather than solid material. As she drew closer, the image in the mirror began to change. Laurel gasped as she saw not her own face, but Jane's, looking back at her with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Jane," Laurel whispered, reaching out to touch the glass. The moment her fingers made contact, the room around her dissolved. Laurel found herself standing in the same space, but it was different. Lived in, cluttered with the detritus of a student's life. And there, sitting on the bed, was Jane herself. "You shouldn't be here," Jane said, her voice echoing strangely. "It's not safe." Laurel's heart raced. "Jane, I need to know. What really happened that night? How can I save Courtney?
Jane stood, moving to the desk where a familiar journal lay open.
I thought I could end it, she said softly. I thought by sacrificing myself I could break the cycle. But I was wrong, Laurel. The door. It can't be closed from this side. The scene shifted, flickering like an old film. Now Laurel saw Jane in the chapel, her hands pressed against an invisible barrier, her face contorted in anguish. Beyond her, barely visible, were shadowy figures reaching out with grasping hands. "The 17!" Laurel breathed. Jane turned to her, her eyes filled with an otherworldly light. "They're trapped, Laurel, caught between worlds. And they're hungry, so hungry." Another shift, and Laurel found herself back in room 713, but it was different again. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating two figures locked in a heated argument, Jane and a man Laurel didn't recognize. "You can't do this," the man was saying, his voice desperate. "Think of the baby. Think of us." Jane's face was set in grim determination. "There is no us, Michael. There's only the cycle, and it has to end, one way or another."
Laurel's breath caught in her throat.
"Michael." The name stirred something in her memory, a face glimpsed in the background of an old photograph, a name mentioned in passing and quickly hushed. Before she could process this new information, the scene changed again. Now Laurel was standing in the chapel, watching as Jane performed an intricate ritual, her swollen belly evidence of her advanced pregnancy. Candles flickered in a complex pattern on the floor, and Jane's voice rose and fell in a chant that made Laurel's skin crawl. Suddenly Jane cried out in pain, doubling over. Laurel rushed forward instinctively, but her hands passed right through Jane's form. "No," Jane gasped, looking up with fear-filled eyes. "It's too soon. The door, it's opening." A wind that Laurel couldn't feel whipped through the chapel, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. When light returned, Laurel found herself back in room 713, the full-length mirror now showing her own reflection once more. But she wasn't alone. In the glass she could see figures standing behind her. Jane, looking young and determined, Courtney, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. And others, women with familiar features stretching back through time. The Courtney women, generation after generation. "The cycle must be broken," they said in unison, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. "But the price is high. Are you willing to pay it, Laurel Snow?" Before Laurel could respond, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. The figures in the mirror vanished, leaving Laurel alone and shaken. "Laurel!" Brett's voice called from the hallway. "Are you in there? We've been looking everywhere for you." Laurel took a deep, steadying breath, trying to process everything she had seen and heard. As she moved to open the door, her foot kicked something on the floor. Looking down, she saw a small, leather-bound book she hadn't noticed before. With trembling hands, she picked it up. On the cover, in faded gold lettering, were the words, "The Courtney Legacy, a Guide to Breaking the Cycle." Clutching the book to her chest, Laurel opened the door to find Brett and Ian waiting, their faces etched with concern. "What happened?" Ian asked, taking in Laurel's pale face and shaking hands. "What did you see?" Laurel looked from Ian to Brett, then back at the room behind her. The mirror stood innocently in the corner, reflecting nothing but the ordinary contents of a storage room. "Everything," Laurel said softly. "I saw everything. And I know what we have to do." As they hurried away from room 713, Laurel could have sworn she heard Jane's voice one last time, whispering on the edge of hearing, "Be careful, Laurel. The door swings both ways, and what lies beyond. It's more than any of us imagined." The book in Laurel's hands seemed to pulse with potential, a roadmap to unraveling a century-old mystery. But as they descended the stairs, heading towards an uncertain future, Laurel couldn't shake the feeling that the true test was yet to come. The cycle was nearing its end, and Laurel Snow, armed with newfound knowledge and the strength of generations of Courtney women, was ready to face whatever lay on the other side of that door in the dark. Chapter 17, Family Secrets. The Courtney family estate loomed before Laurel, its Victorian architecture a stark silhouette against the stormy sky. She stood at the wrought iron gates, the Courtney legacy book clutched tightly to her chest, gathering her courage for what she knew would be a difficult confrontation. Brett's hand on her shoulder startled her from her reverie. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. Laurel nodded, her jaw set with determination. "We need answers, Brett, and they're in there." As if on cue, the gates creaked open. At the top of the long driveway stood a figure Laurel recognized from old photographs, Jane's grandfather, Edward Courtney. Even at a distance, she could see the weight of years and secrets in the slump of his shoulders. "Miss Snow," he called out, his voice carrying on the wind. "We've been expecting you." The walk up the driveway felt like crossing a threshold into another world. Laurel was acutely aware of the book in her arms, of the knowledge it contained and the questions it raised. Behind her, she could hear Brett's steady footsteps, a comforting presence in the face of the unknown. Edward Courtney met them at the front door, his roomy eyes sharp with a mixture of wariness and resignation. "Come in," he said, gesturing them inside. "It's time we talked." The interior of the Courtney home was like stepping back in time. Heavy velvet drapes, antique furniture, and walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors created an atmosphere of faded grandeur. Laurel's eyes were drawn to a painting above the fireplace, a young woman with Jane's features, but dressed in the style of the early 1900s. "My grandmother," Edward said, following Laurel's gaze. "Elizabeth Courtney. She was the first to truly understand the weight of our family's legacy." He led them into a study where a woman Laurel recognized as Jane's mother, Catherine, sat rigid in a high-backed chair. Her face was a mask of carefully controlled emotion. "Why are you here, Miss Snow?" Catherine asked, her voice brittle. "Haven't we all suffered enough?" Laurel took a deep breath, then placed the Courtney legacy on the desk between them. "I'm here because of this. Because of Jane and Courtney and a cycle that's been repeating for over a century. I'm here for the truth." Edward sank heavily into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 80-plus years. "The truth," he said softly. Such a simple word for such a complex thing. Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "Father, we can't. We must," Edward interrupted. He turned to Laurel, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and resolve. "You know about Jane's child?" Laurel nodded. "Courtney, she's at Douglas Academy now, but that's not all, is it? There's more to this story." Edward reached for an ornate box on the desk, opening it to reveal a stack of old letters and photographs. "The Courtney women have always been special, sensitive to things others can't see or feel. It's a gift and a curse." He spread out several photos, each showing a young woman with Jane's features spanning decades. "Every generation, the gift manifests in one daughter, and every generation, that daughter is drawn into the cycle at Douglas Academy. The 17 souls," Laurel said softly. "The door in the dark." Edward nodded grimly. "Ambrose Douglas opened something that should have remained closed. The Courtney women became the key to keeping that door from opening fully." Catherine stood abruptly, moving to the window. "We tried to protect Jane, to keep her away from Douglas, but the pull was too strong." Laurel's mind raced, connecting dots. "Jane's pregnancy, it wasn't just unexpected. It was part of the cycle, wasn't it?" Edward's face crumpled with guilt. "We didn't know, not until it was too late. Jane discovered the truth about our family, about her role in it all. She thought she could break the cycle by sacrificing herself. But it didn't work," Laurel said, her heart aching for Jane, for the weight she must have carried. "No," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It didn't. And we were left with an impossible choice." Edward pulled out a final document from the box, an adoption certificate. "We arranged for the baby to be adopted in secret, we thought. We hoped that by separating her from the Courtney name, from Douglas Academy, we might break the cycle. Laurel felt a chill run down her spine, but Courtney found her way back. The pull was too strong. Catherine turned from the window, tears streaming down her face. We should have told her the truth, protected her. Instead, she trailed off, overcome with emotion. Brett, who had been silent until now, spoke up. What about Courtney's father? Does he know? A heavy silence fell over the room. Edward and Catherine exchanged a loaded glance. Michael Ramsey, Edward said finally, the headmaster's son. He and Jane were close, but when Jane discovered she was pregnant, she pushed him away, tried to protect him from the truth. Laurel felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Brett's sharp intake of breath told her he was equally shocked. Does Brett know? Laurel asked, her voice hoarse. That Courtney is his sister. Catherine shook her head. No, we made sure of that. The fewer people who knew, the safer we thought Courtney would be. Laurel's mind whirled with the implications, the connections between the families, the weight of secrets spanning generations. It was almost too much to comprehend. What about this? She asked, placing her hand on the Courtney Legacy book. What does it mean? Edward's eyes widened in recognition. Where did you get that? It appeared to me, Laurel said, in room 713 at Douglas. I think Jane wanted me to find it. Edward reached for the book with trembling hands. This was Elizabeth's, my grandmother's. She spent her life researching ways to break the cycle. We thought it was lost decades ago. He opened the book, revealing pages of intricate diagrams, arcane symbols and handwritten notes. If there's a way to end this, to truly close the door that Ambrose Douglas opened, it would be in here. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, causing them all to start. In the distance, thunder rumbled ominously. Catherine's face paled. It's starting, isn't it? The final phase of the cycle. Laurel stood, a sense of urgency flooding through her. We need to get back to Douglas. Now. Courtney's in danger, and I think I might know how to save her. As they hurried from the study, Laurel caught sight of her reflection in a hallway mirror. For a moment, just a heartbeat, she could have sworn she saw Jane standing behind her, a sad smile on her face. I'm sorry, Laurel whispered. I'm sorry you had to carry this alone, but I promise I'll do everything I can to finish what you started. The reflection wavered, and then Jane was gone. But as Laurel followed the others out to the car, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of the Courtney legacy of Jane's sacrifice settled on her shoulders. The final confrontation was coming. And Laurel Snow, armed with the truth and the collected knowledge of generations of Courtney women, was ready to face whatever lay beyond that door in the dark. As they drove back towards Douglas Academy, the storm clouds gathered overhead, dark and heavy with portent. The cycle was nearing its end, and the fate of not just Courtney but perhaps the world itself hung in the balance. Chapter 18, Brett's Breakdown. The drive back to Douglas Academy was tense, the silence in the car broken only by the rumble of thunder and the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers battling the increasingly heavy rain. Laurel sat in the passenger seat, the Courtney legacy open on her lap, her mind racing as she tried to decipher its cryptic contents. Brett, behind the wheel, hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the Courtney estate. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched tight. Laurel could almost see the gears turning in his head, processing the earth-shattering revelations about his family and his unexpected connection to Courtney. As they pulled into the Academy's parking lot, the rain was coming down in sheets. Brett killed the engine but made no move to get out of the car. "Brett," Laurel said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. "Are you okay?" He flinched at her touch, then let out a bitter laugh. "Okay, am I okay?" His voice rose, tinged with hysteria. "I just found out that my father has been lying to me my entire life, that I have a sister I never knew about, that my family is somehow tied up in all this madness. So, no, Laurel, I'm not okay." Laurel withdrew her hand, her heart aching for her friend. "I know it's a lot to take in, but we need to focus. Courtney's in danger, and Courtney!" Brett spat the name like a curse. "My sister, the girl who looks exactly like Jane, who might be the key to some kind of, what, supernatural apocalypse." He turned to Laurel, his eyes wild. "How long have you known? How long have you been keeping this from me?" "Brett, I swear, I only just found out myself. I would have told you if—" But Brett was already out of the car, slamming the door behind him. Laurel scrambled to follow, clutching the book to her chest as she ran after him through the rain. She caught up to him in the main hall, water dripping from both of them and pooling on the polished floor. Brett was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair in agitation. "It all makes sense now," he was muttering. "The way my father always watched Courtney, the secrets, the whispers. God, I was so blind." "Brett, please," Laurel pleaded. "I know you're upset, but we don't have time for this. We need to find Courtney before—" "Before what?" Brett whirled on her. "Before she opens a mystical door. Before she completes the cycle. Tell me, Laurel, what exactly are we trying to prevent here?" Laurel took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "The cycle that's been repeating at Douglas for over a century. The one that took Jane, that's been taking 17 souls every generation. If we don't stop it now, it could be catastrophic." Brett's laugh was hollow. "Catastrophic. Right. And I suppose you have it all figured out. You and your magic book." "It's not like that," Laurel said, frustrated. "I'm trying to understand it all just like you are. But we need to work together if we're going to save Courtney and stop whatever's coming." For a moment something softened in Brett's eyes, but then his gaze fell on the Courtney legacy in Laurel's arms, and his expression hardened once more. "Give me the book, Laurel." She took a step back. "What? Brett, no. We need this to—" "To what?" he snarled, advancing on her. "To perform some ritual. To sacrifice my sister like Jane was sacrificed." Laurel's back hit the wall. "That's not what this is about." "Brett, please, you're not thinking clearly." "Oh, I'm thinking very clearly," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "For the first time in my life, I'm seeing everything with perfect clarity. My father, this school, you're all part of it. Part of whatever took Jane from us." He lunged for the book, but Laurel ducked under his arm, sprinting down the corridor. She could hear Brett's footsteps pounding behind her, his ragged breathing echoing off the walls. Laurel's mind raced as she ran. She needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere she could try to reach Brett to make him understand. But more than that, she needed to find Courtney before it was too late. As she rounded a corner, she collided hard with someone, sending them both sprawling. Laurel looked up, dazed, to see Headmaster Ramsay staring down at her with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Miss Snow, what on earth—" "Dad!" Brett's voice rang out, filled with a potent mixture of anger and anguish. "Did you know? Did you know about Courtney?" The headmaster's face drained of colour. "Brett, son, I can explain." But Brett was beyond explanations. With a roar of rage, he charged at his father, sending them both crashing into a display case. Glass shattered, raining down around them as they grappled on the floor. Laurel scrambled to her feet, clutching the book tightly. She watched in horror as Brett pinned his father down, his fist raised. "Brett, stop!" she cried out. "This isn't the way." For a heartbeat the world seemed to freeze. Brett looked up at Laurel, his eyes clearing for a moment as if waking from a trance. But then a shadow passed over his face, something dark and ancient that didn't belong there. "You're right," he said, his voice eerily calm. "This isn't the way. I know what I have to do now." He stood, leaving his father groaning on the floor amidst the broken glass. Brett's gaze was fixed on something Laurel couldn't see, his expression a mixture of resolve and something close to rapture. "I can hear them, Laurel," he said softly. "The 17. They're calling to me, showing me the truth." A chill ran down Laurel's spine. "Brett, whatever you're hearing, it's not real. It's part of the cycle, trying to manipulate you." But Brett was already moving, striding purposefully down the hall. "I know where Courtney is," he called back. I know how to end this once and for all. Laurel hesitated, torn between helping the headmaster and following Brett. But one look at Ramsay told her he would be all right. The true danger lay ahead. I'm sorry, she said to the headmaster as she ran after Brett. I'll bring him back, I promise. As Laurel raced through the twisting corridors of Douglas Academy, the storm outside reached a fever pitch. Lightning illuminated the windows, casting Brett's silhouette in stark relief as he moved with single-minded purpose towards some unknown destination. Laurel's heart pounded in her chest, fear and determination warring within her. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond rational thought, that they were approaching a point of no return. The cycle was nearing its end, the door in the dark was creaking open, and Brett, her friend, her link to the past, was being drawn inexorably into its maw. But as she clutched the Courtney legacy to her chest, feeling the weight of generations of knowledge and sacrifice, Laurel steeled herself for what was to come. She had made a promise to Jane, to Courtney, to herself, and she intended to keep it no matter the cost. The final confrontation loomed, and the fate of not just Douglas Academy, but perhaps the world itself, hung in the balance. Laurel Snow, armed with truth and love and the legacy of the Courtney women, was ready to face whatever lay beyond that door in the dark, even if it meant confronting the darkness within those she held dear. Chapter 19, The Manuscript. Laurel's footsteps echoed through the empty corridors of Douglas Academy as she pursued Brett, her mind racing. The storm outside had reached a fever pitch, lightning illuminating the windows in stark flashes, thunder shaking the very foundations of the old building. As she rounded a corner, Laurel skidded to a halt. Brett was nowhere to be seen, but before her stood a door she had never noticed before. It was old, the wood dark with age, and carved into its surface was a familiar symbol, the same one she had seen in The Courtney Legacy. With trembling fingers, Laurel reached out and turned the handle. The door swung open silently, revealing a small circular room lined with bookshelves. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it lay a manuscript bound in dark leather. Laurel approached cautiously, her heart pounding. As she drew closer, she could make out the title embossed in faded gold letters, The Door in the Dark by Jane Courtney. "Oh, Jane!" Laurel whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cover reverently. As she did, a jolt of energy surged through her, and the room around her seemed to blur and shift. When her vision cleared, Laurel found herself in what appeared to be a memory. Jane sat at a desk, her face pale and drawn, furiously writing in the manuscript. Laurel could see the swell of her pregnant belly, and her heart ached for her friend. Jane, Laurel called out, but her voice made no sound. This was a vision of the past, she realized, not a true visitation. As if in response to her unheard question, Jane looked up, her eyes seeming to meet Laurel's across time and space. "I'm sorry, Laurel," she said softly. "I wish I could have told you everything, but maybe now, through this, you'll understand." The scene shifted, and Laurel was back in the circular room. Without hesitation, she opened the manuscript and began to read. October 1st, 2009, I've decided to call this manuscript The Door in the Dark, not just because it's the title of Laurel's story that haunts me so, but because it's the perfect metaphor for what we face. There is a door, hidden in the shadows of Douglas Academy, that leads to places beyond our comprehension. And it's opening, Laurel. God help us all, it's opening. I've seen visions of what lies beyond. The 17 souls trapped in a limbo of our making, the hungry darkness that seeks to break through. But I've also seen hope, a way to end this cycle once and for all. The Courtney women have always been the key, our bloodline tied to the ritual that keeps the door from opening fully. But we've been playing defense for too long. It's time to take the fight to them. Laurel's hands shook as she turned the pages, absorbing Jane's words. The manuscript detailed Jane's discoveries about the Douglas massacre, the true nature of the cycle, and her growing understanding of her own role in it all. October 10th, 2009. I know now why I'm pregnant. The child I carry, my daughter, she's meant to be the next in the Courtney line. The next sacrifice to keep the door closed, but I won't let that happen. I can't. I've found a way to break the cycle, but the cost... Oh, Laurel, the cost is almost too much to bear, but I have to try. For my daughter, for all of us. As Laurel read on, tears streaming down her face, she began to understand the full weight of what Jane had attempted. The ritual she had performed wasn't meant to close the door permanently, but to create a sort of firebreak, a temporary barrier that would buy time for someone to find a permanent solution. October 14th, 2009. This will be my final entry. Tomorrow I'll perform the ritual. If it works, my sacrifice will disrupt the cycle long enough for the truth to come to light. Long enough for you to find this manuscript, Laurel. I've seen you in my visions. You, standing at the threshold of that dark door, holding the key to ending this once and for all. I'm so sorry to place this burden on you, my dear friend, but I know you have the strength to see it through. Remember, the door swings both ways. What was opened can be closed, but it will take more than just blood and sacrifice. It will take love and truth and the strength to face the darkness within ourselves. The answer lies in the Courtney legacy and in this manuscript. Together, they hold the key to breaking the cycle. But be warned, the closer you get to the truth, the harder the darkness will fight to stop you. I love you, Laurel. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything, but I believe in you. You can end this. You can save us all. Goodbye, my friend. And good luck! Jane, as Laurel read the final words, a gust of wind swept through the room, ruffling the pages of the manuscript. She looked up to see the ghostly figure of Jane standing before her, a sad smile on her face. "Jane," Laurel breathed, reaching out instinctively. The apparition shook her head. "There's no time, Laurel. Brett is in danger. Courtney is in danger. You have to hurry." "But I don't understand," Laurel said, her voice trembling. "How do I stop this? How do I close the door?" Jane's form began to fade, but her voice lingered.
The answer is in your heart, Laurel.
"In the love we shared, in the bonds that tie us all together. Remember, the door swings both ways. What was broken can be mended." With that, Jane vanished, leaving Laurel alone in the circular room. Outside, the storm reached a crescendo, a particularly loud crack of thunder shaking dust from the shelves. Laurel clutched the manuscript to her chest, her mind reeling with all she had learned. The pieces were falling into place, the cycle, the ritual, the true nature of the door in the dark. But time was running out. With renewed determination, Laurel turned and ran from the room. She had to find Brett and Courtney before it was too late. The final confrontation was at hand, and armed with Jane's words and the knowledge of generations of Courtney women, Laurel was ready to face whatever darkness awaited. As she raced through the corridors of Douglas Academy, Laurel could feel the very air growing thick with supernatural energy. The door was opening, the boundary between worlds thinning. But now, thanks to Jane's sacrifice and her own unwavering determination, Laurel knew she had a chance to end this cycle once and for all. The storm raged on, but in her heart, Laurel carried a light that no darkness could extinguish. She was ready to step through the door in the dark and face whatever lay beyond. For Jane, for Courtney, for all of them. Chapter 20. Exercising the Past. The old chapel of Douglas Academy stood silent and expectant in the eye of the storm. Outside, the wind howled and rain lashed against the stained-glass windows, but within, an uneasy calm prevailed. Laurel stood at the altar, surrounded by flickering candles, her heart pounding as she watched the seats slowly fill. She had called for this gathering, part memorial service, part exorcism, in a desperate bid to confront the past and break the cycle that had claimed so many lives. Jane's manuscript clutched tightly in one hand, the Courtney legacy in the other. Laurel felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. As the last of the attendees filed in, Laurel's gaze swept over the assembled group. Headmaster Ramsay sat in the front row, his face a mask of guilt and fear. Beside him, Catherine Courtney dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Edward Courtney stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Ian Blackwood hovered near the back, looking as if he might bolt at any moment. And there, slipping in just as Laurel was about to begin, came Brett, his eyes wild and unfocused. Taking a deep breath, Laurel stepped forward. "We're here today to remember Jane Courtney," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "But we're also here to confront the truth about her death, about the dark history of this school, and about the cycle that has claimed too many lives for too long." A murmur ran through the crowd. Laurel pressed on. "For over a century, Douglas Academy has been haunted by a secret. A door, opened by Ambrose Douglas, that leads to places beyond our understanding. And every 17 years, that door threatens to open fully, demanding a terrible price." She held up Jane's manuscript. "Jane discovered the truth. She tried to end the cycle, to protect her unborn child and all of us. But her sacrifice wasn't enough. The door is opening again, and unless we act now, more will die." Headmaster Ramsay stood abruptly. "Miss Snow, I must insist that you stop this at once. You're speaking of things you don't understand." "No," Laurel cut him off, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "It's time for the truth, all of it. No more secrets, no more lies." She turned to Catherine and Edward. "Jane's child, your granddaughter, she's here at Douglas. Courtney Harris." Gasps and shocked whispers filled the chapel. Catherine's sob echoed in the sudden silence that followed. "It's true," Edward said, his voice heavy with regret. We thought we could protect her by keeping her away, but the pull of this place, of her legacy, was too strong." Brett surged to his feet. "You knew?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "All this time you knew I had a sister." Headmaster Ramsay reached for his son. "Brett, please. We were trying to protect you both. Protect us." Brett laughed bitterly. "By lying, by letting us walk blindly into this madness." As tensions rose, the candles around the altar began to flicker wildly. A cold wind swept through the chapel, though all the windows were closed. Laurel raised her hands, calling for calm. "This is what the cycle wants," she said urgently. "It feeds on our fear, our anger, our guilt. But we can break it. Jane showed us how." She opened the manuscript, her voice clear as she read Jane's final words. As she spoke of love, of sacrifice, of the power to face the darkness within ourselves, a change came over the gathered crowd. The anger and fear began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. "Jane believed in us," Laurel concluded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She believed we could end this once and for all. But we have to do it together." A moment of profound silence followed her words. Then, slowly, people began to stand. Ian stepped forward, his face etched with remorse. "I loved Jane," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I should have done more to help her, to protect her. I'm so sorry." Catherine rose next, supported by Edward. "We failed our daughter," she said softly, "and we failed our granddaughter. But no more. We're here to make it right." One by one, others came forward. Teachers who had suspected something was wrong but had stayed silent. Students who had glimpsed the supernatural undercurrents of the school but had been too afraid to speak up. Each confession, each acknowledgement of the truth seemed to lift a weight from the room. As the last person spoke, the candles around the altar flared brilliantly. A collective gasp rose as a figure began to materialize in their midst. Jane, looking just as she had on that fateful night 15 years ago. "Jane," Laurel breathed, reaching out instinctively. The apparition smiled, an expression of profound relief on her face. "You did it, Laurel. You brought the truth to light." She turned to face the gathered crowd. "The cycle has fed on our secrets, our fears, for too long. But love is stronger. It's the key to closing the door once and for all." Jane's gaze fell on Brett, who stood transfixed. "Brother," she said softly, "protect her, love her, break the cycle." Before Brett could respond, a violent tremor shook the chapel. The stained-glass windows rattled in their frames, and a deep, otherworldly moan seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. "It's fighting back," Jane said urgently. "The door, it's opening. You have to hurry." Laurel clutched the Courtney legacy and Jane's manuscript. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Jane's form was already beginning to fade. "Find Courtney," she said, her voice growing distant. "The final confrontation. It has to be at the heart of it all. Where it began." "The old library," Edward Courtney said suddenly. "Where Ambrose Douglas performed the original ritual." Jane nodded, her figure now barely more than a shimmer in the air. "Hurry, Laurel. And remember, the door swings both ways. Love is the key." With a final, brilliant flare of the candles, Jane vanished. In her wake, a sense of purpose settled over the gathered group. Laurel turned to face them, her expression resolute. "We know what we have to do," she said. "Who's with me?" Hands raised throughout the chapel. Brett stepped forward, his earlier anger replaced by determination. "Let's finish this," he said. "For Jane, for Courtney, for all of us." As they filed out of the chapel, the storm outside reached a fever pitch. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the grounds of Douglas Academy in stark relief. And there, in the distance, a figure could be seen running towards the old library. Courtney! Laurel's heart raced. The final confrontation was at hand. Armed with the truth, with the support of those around her, and with the love that had driven Jane's sacrifice, she was ready to face whatever lay beyond that door in the dark. The cycle was ending. One way or another, this long night of secrets and shadows would soon be over. Chapter 21. The Truth Unveiled. The old library of Douglas Academy stood before them, its Gothic architecture looming ominously against the storm-ravaged sky. Laurel, Brett, and their unlikely band of allies gathered at the entrance, the weight of history and the urgency of their mission hanging heavy in the air. Laurel's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the ornate door handle. "This is it," she said, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "Whatever happens in there, thank you all for being here, for believing." With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The group filed in, their flashlights cutting through the gloom to reveal rows upon rows of ancient books, their spines glittering with gold leaf and forgotten knowledge. At the center of the room stood Courtney, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Behind her, shimmering like a heat mirage, was the door, the same impossible door of shadows and mist that Laurel had glimpsed before. "Courtney!" Brett called out, his voice cracking. "Please, don't do this. We can help you." Courtney turned, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. "You don't understand," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "This is my legacy, my duty. I have to complete the cycle to keep the door closed." Laurel stepped forward, Jane's manuscript clutched to her chest. "No, Courtney, that's what they want you to think. But there's another way." As if in response to her words, the air in the library began to thicken, shadows coalescing into vaguely human shapes. The spectral forms of the 17 victims of the Douglas massacre materialized around them, their faces contorted in eternal anguish. Headmaster Ramsay fell to his knees, overcome by the sight. "Oh, God," he moaned, "what have we done?" Laurel's voice rang out, clear and strong. "We've perpetuated a cycle of pain and sacrifice for too long, but it ends now." She opened Jane's manuscript, her words carrying power as she began to read. "The door swings both ways. What was open can be closed, but it will take more than blood and death. It requires truth and love and the courage to face our darkest selves." As Laurel spoke, the spectral figures seemed to grow more solid, more present, and with them came others, the shades of all those who had been sacrificed over the decades to keep the door closed. "Don't you see?" Laurel continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "Every time we fed the cycle with another sacrifice, we made the door stronger. But Jane found another way, a way to break the cycle once and for all." She turned to Courtney, her eyes filled with compassion. "You're not alone in this, Courtney. You never were. Your mother, Jane, she loved you so much she was willing to die to protect you, and now it's our turn to stand with you." Brett moved to stand beside his sister, taking her hand. "I'm here," he said softly. "I'm sorry I didn't know that I wasn't there for you before. But I'm here now." Tears streamed down Courtney's face as she looked from Brett to Laurel to the gathered crowd. "But the door? If I don't complete the ritual, it will open fully. The darkness will come through." "No," Edward Courtney said, stepping forward. "We were wrong all these years. The door's power comes from our fear, our willingness to sacrifice others to save ourselves. But if we stand together, if we face it with love and truth—" As if to punctuate his words, the door behind Courtney began to pulse, tendrils of darkness reaching out hungrily. The spectral figures of the 17 pressed closer, their voices rising in a mournful keen. Laurel raised Jane's manuscript high. "It's time to end this, to set them free, to set ourselves free. Are you with me?" A chorus of affirmations rang out. Even Headmaster Ramsay, his face streaked with tears, nodded resolutely. Laurel began to read from the manuscript, her voice blending with the words from the Courtney legacy that Brett now held open. As they spoke in unison, a change came over the room. The oppressive darkness began to recede, replaced by a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. The spectral figures of the 17 turned towards the door, their expressions shifting from anguish to hope. One by one they began to fade, not into darkness, but into the light. Courtney gasped, her eyes wide. "I can feel them," she whispered. "They're free!" The door shuddered, its edges beginning to blur and dissipate. But as it did, a final, violent surge of energy pulsed outward. Laurel stumbled, the manuscript falling from her grasp. In that moment of vulnerability, a tendril of darkness lashed out, wrapping around Laurel's wrist. She cried out in pain as it began to pull her towards the rapidly collapsing door. "Laurel!" Brett shouted, lunging for her, but it was Courtney who reached her first. With a look of fierce determination, she grasped Laurel's hand. "Together," she said. "We end this together." A blinding light erupted from their joined hands, enveloping the room. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Laurel felt as if she was everywhere and nowhere at once, witnessing the entirety of Douglas Academy's dark history in a single searing instant. And then, with a sound like 1,000 voices sighing in relief, the light faded. The door was gone. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the library for over a century had lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. Laurel looked around, her eyes wide with wonder. The spectral figures were gone, but in their place stood Jane, smiling with pride and love. "You did it," Jane said softly. "You broke the cycle. You set us all free." As Jane's form began to fade, Laurel felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of completion, of understanding. She turned to face the gathered crowd, her voice steady as she spoke the truth that had been hidden for so long. "There's something you all need to know," she said. "Something I've just realized myself. I'm not just Jane's friend. I'm her daughter. Courtney's sister." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the group. Brett stared at Laurel in shock, while Courtney's eyes filled with tears of recognition. "Somehow Jane found a way to protect me, to keep me separate from the cycle," Laurel continued. "She split her essence, her legacy between Courtney and me. That's why I was drawn back here, why I could see and feel things others couldn't." Edward Courtney stepped forward, his face a mixture of grief and wonder. "Of course," he said softly. "2 daughters, 2 keys to unlock the door, or to close it forever." As the full implications of this revelation sank in, Laurel felt a profound shift in her understanding of herself, of her place in the world. She looked at Courtney, her sister, and felt a surge of love and protectiveness. "What happens now?" someone in the crowd asked. Laurel squared her shoulders, her decision made. "Now we heal, we remember, and we make sure nothing like this ever happens again." She turned to Headmaster Ramsay. "Douglas Academy needs to reckon with its past. all of it. No more secrets, no more cover-ups. Will you help make that happen?" Ramsay nodded solemnly. "Yes, it's long overdue." As the group began to file out of the library, Laurel lingered behind with Brett and Courtney. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history and newfound connection settling around them. "So," Brett said finally, a hint of his old humour creeping into his voice. "Two sisters. I guess I've got my work cut out for me as a big brother." Courtney laughed, the sound bright and free in a way it had never been before. "I think we've all got some adjusting to do." Laurel smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "We'll figure it out, together." As they left the library, stepping out into the first rays of dawn breaking through the dissipating storm clouds, Laurel felt a profound sense of hope. The cycle was broken, the truth was out, and though the road ahead might be challenging, she knew that with love, honesty, and the strength of the bonds they'd forged, they could face whatever came next. The door in the dark was closed, and in its place a new chapter was beginning. Chapter 22, Healing the Wounds. The weeks following the dramatic events in the old library passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Douglas Academy, once shrouded in secrets and supernatural dread, now bustled with a new kind of energy, one of renewal, of reckoning, of healing. Laurel stood at the window of her room, watching students cross the quad below. The change in atmosphere was palpable, even from a distance. Gone was the unconscious hurry, the furtive glances, the unspoken fear that had permeated the campus for so long. In its place was a sense of openness, of cautious optimism. A knock at her door pulled Laurel from her reverie. "Come in," she called. Brett entered, a stack of papers under his arm and a wry smile on his face. "The Truth and Reconciliation Committee is in full swing," he said, dropping the papers on Laurel's desk. Who knew there'd be so much paperwork involved in exercising a century of dark secrets? Laurel couldn't help but smile. In the aftermath of their confrontation with the supernatural, Brett had thrown himself into the task of documenting and addressing the school's troubled history. It was, she knew, his way of making amends, of being the big brother he hadn't known he needed to be for so long. "How's Courtney doing?" Laurel asked, her thoughts turning to her newfound sister. Brett's expression softened. "Better. The therapy sessions seem to be helping. She's talking more, engaging with her classmates. It's good to see." Laurel nodded, a complex mixture of emotions welling up inside her. The revelation of her true parentage, of her connection to Jane and Courtney, was still something she was grappling with. And the other students. How are they handling everything? "It's a process," Brett admitted. "Some are angry, some are scared, but mostly there's a sense of relief, like a weight has been lifted." He paused, his gaze turning serious. "Dad wants to see you, by the way. He's in the chapel." Laurel felt a flutter of anxiety. Her relationship with Headmaster Ramsay was complicated, to say the least. But she knew this conversation was necessary. "Thanks, Brett. I'll head over there now." As she made her way across the campus, Laurel was struck by the physical changes taking place. Walls that had once been blank were now adorned with student artwork, vibrant murals depicting scenes of hope and renewal. The old imposing iron gates had been replaced with an open archway, a symbol of the school's new commitment to transparency. The chapel, when she entered, was bathed in soft light streaming through the newly restored stained glass windows. Headmaster Ramsay stood at the altar, his back to her, shoulders slumped with the weight of years of secrets. "Headmaster," Laurel said softly, announcing her presence. He turned, and Laurel was struck by how much older he looked, how tired. But there was a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Laurel," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for coming. I owe you an apology. Many apologies, in fact." Laurel moved to stand beside him, her gaze taking in the changes to the chapel. Where once there had been austere wooden pews, there were now comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. The walls, once bare, now held photographs and mementos, a living history of Douglas Academy, both the good and the bad. "We all have a lot to atone for," Laurel said carefully, But what matters now is how we move forward. Ramsay nodded, running a hand through his thinning hair. That's actually why I wanted to speak with you. The board and I have been discussing the future of Douglas Academy. We want to make sure nothing like this ever happens again, and we think you might be the key to that. Laurel turned to him, surprised. Me. We'd like to offer you a permanent position, Ramsay continued. Not just as a writer in residence, but as a kind of guardian, I suppose. Someone who understands our history, who can help guide us into a better future. The offer took Laurel's breath away. She thought of Jane, of the sacrifice she had made, of Courtney still finding her place in this new reality, of all the students who had suffered knowingly or unknowingly under the weight of Douglas Academy's dark legacy. I need some time to think about it, she said finally. Ramsay nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course. Take all the time you need. As Laurel left the chapel, her mind whirling with possibilities, she found her feet carrying her towards a familiar destination, room 713, the storage room that had started it all. She hesitated at the door, memories of her supernatural experiences flooding back. But as she turned the handle, she was met not with darkness and dread, but with light and a sense of peace. The room had been transformed. The narrow bed and desk were gone, replaced by comfortable seating and bookshelves. On the walls hung photographs and artwork, Jane's life celebrated in full colour. And there, on a small table by the window, sat a framed copy of The Door in the Dark, Jane's manuscript that had been key to breaking the cycle. Laurel's eyes filled with tears as she took in the space. This wasn't just a room anymore, it was a memorial, a testament to Jane's love and sacrifice. Do you like it? Laurel turned to see Courtney standing in the doorway, a hesitant smile on her face. It's beautiful, Laurel said, her voice thick with emotion. When did you do all this? Courtney entered the room, running her hand along the spines of the books on the shelves. It was a group effort. Brett helped and some of the other students. We needed a place to remember. To heal. Laurel pulled her sister into a tight embrace, feeling the connection between them, the legacy of Jane's love, stronger than ever. As they stood there, bathed in the warm afternoon light, Laurel felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The wounds of the past were still raw, the healing process far from over. But here, in this room that had once been a nexus of fear and secrecy, hope was taking root. The door in the dark was closed. But in its place, countless other doors were opening, doors to understanding, to forgiveness, to a future unshackled by the sins of the past. Laurel Snow, daughter of Jane Courtney, sister to Courtney Harris, found herself standing at the threshold of one such door. And as she looked out at the transformed Douglas Academy, at the family she had found and the legacy she now carried, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. Not alone, but surrounded by love, truth, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of their shared history. The healing had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the story of Douglas Academy and in Laurel's own life was just beginning to unfold. Chapter 23. The New Manuscript. The soft glow of the desk lamp illuminated Laurel's face as her fingers flew across the keyboard. Outside her window, the grounds of Douglas Academy lay peaceful under a blanket of stars, the quiet broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of wind through the ancient trees. Laurel paused, her hands hovering over the keys as she reread the last paragraph she had written. The truth, Amelia realized, was not a fixed point, but a living, breathing thing. It shifted and changed, revealed and concealed, much like the mysterious door that had haunted Blackwood Academy for generations. But unlike that door, which had been built on secrets and sacrifice, the truth, once fully embraced, had the power to heal, to transform, to set free. She sat back, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. This new manuscript was unlike anything she had written before. It was part fiction, part memoir, part historical record, a tapestry woven from the threads of her own experiences, Jane's legacy, and the long, dark history of Douglas Academy. A soft knock at her door broke her concentration. "Come in," she called, stretching her stiff muscles. Courtney entered, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting one of the mugs filled with Laurel's favourite chamomile tea on the desk. "You're a lifesaver," Laurel said gratefully, inhaling the soothing aroma. "How did you know I was still up?" Courtney shrugged, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Sister's intuition, or maybe it's just that I know how you get when you're in the writing zone." Laurel laughed, marvelling once again at how natural it felt to have Courtney in her life, to be part of a family she hadn't known she was missing. "Fair enough. Want to hear what I've been working on?" Courtney nodded eagerly, curling up in the armchair by the window. Laurel turned back to her computer and began to read aloud. "Blackwood Academy stood as a testament to the power of stories. Those we tell others, those we tell ourselves, and those that are written in stone and blood and memory. For Amelia Blackwood, uncovering the truth behind her mother's disappearance had been only the beginning. Now she faced an even greater challenge, how to tell a story that spanned generations, that touched on truths both beautiful and terrible, without losing sight of the humanity at its core." Laurel paused, looking up at Courtney. "What do you think? Too on the nose?" Courtney shook her head, her eyes shining. "No, it's perfect. It's us, isn't it? Our story, but told in a way that others can understand, can learn from." Laurel nodded, feeling a swell of emotion. "That's the hope. I want to honour Jane's memory and all those who suffered because of the cycle. But I also want to show how we broke free, how we're healing." She turned back to the manuscript, scrolling through the pages she had already written. There were chapters that delved into the history of Blackwood Douglas's Academy, fictionalized accounts of the Douglas massacre and its aftermath. There were passages that explored the nature of family, of legacy, of the choices we make in the face of impossible situations. And woven throughout was the theme of storytelling itself, how the stories we tell shape our reality for better or worse. "You know," Courtney said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking a lot about memory lately, about how two people can experience the same event so differently, how our minds can play tricks on us." Laurel nodded encouragingly, sensing her sister had more to say. "I've been having these flashes, I guess you'd call them. Memories of Jane, of being with her, even though I know that's impossible." Courtney's voice wavered slightly. Do you think that's real, or just my mind trying to fill in the blanks?" Laurel set her mug down, choosing her words carefully. I think memory is more complex than we give it credit for, especially given what we've been through, the supernatural forces we've encountered. Maybe those flashes are echoes of Jane's love, imprinted on your very being." She paused, then added softly, "I have them too sometimes. Little moments, feelings that seem to come from a time before I knew I was Jane's daughter. It's like she found a way to be with us, even when she couldn't be physically present." Courtney's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "That's beautiful, and it feels true, you know, in a way that goes beyond logic or reason." Laurel nodded, turning back to her manuscript. "That's what I'm trying to capture here. Like the truth that exists in the spaces between facts, in the realm of emotion and intuition, the kind of truth that can change lives, heal wounds, bridge impossible gaps." She began to type again, the words flowing freely. Amelia had always believed in the power of stories to change the world. But it wasn't until she stood at the threshold of that impossible door, caught between past and present, reality and myth, that she truly understood. The greatest stories, the ones that resonated across time and space, were not escapes from reality. They were keys to unlocking its deepest truths, its most profound mysteries. And so she wrote, not just for herself or for those who had been lost, but for all those who might come after. For in the end, it was not the darkness that defined them, but the light they chose to kindle in its midst. As Laurel continued to write, with Courtney a comforting presence by her side. She felt a sense of purpose settling over her. This manuscript was more than just a book. It was a testament, a guide, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt trapped by their past or feared the power of their own legacy. Through her words, the story of Douglas Academy, of Jane, of Courtney, of all those who had suffered and triumphed, would live on, not as a cautionary tale of darkness and sacrifice, but as a reminder of the transformative power of truth, love, and the courage to face one's own shadows. The night deepened around them, but in that room, illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp and the warmth of newfound family, Laurel Snow wrote on. Each word a step forward, each page a door opening onto new possibilities, new understandings, new hope. The manuscript grew, a living thing born of memory and imagination, truth and transformation. And with it, Laurel herself continued to heal, to grow, to become the person she was always meant to be. A guardian of stories, a keeper of truths, a bridge between past and future. The door in the dark was closed. But the story was just beginning. Chapter 24, full circle. The early morning mist clung to the grounds of Douglas Academy as Laurel Snow stood at her window, watching the sun slowly burn through the haze. It was her last day as writer-in-residence, a bittersweet moment that felt both like an ending and a beginning. Her room, once a temporary haven, now stood mostly bare. Boxes packed with books and memories lined the walls, ready for the next chapter of her life. But there was one last thing Laurel needed to do before she could truly say goodbye. With a deep breath, she picked up the leather-bound journal on her desk, her own, filled with the notes and drafts of her new manuscript, and headed out into the quiet corridors of the school. As she walked, memories flooded back. The fear and uncertainty of her first days back at Douglas, the gradual unravelling of long-buried secrets, the moment of truth in the old library when everything changed. Each step felt like a journey through time, retracing the path that had led her to this moment. Laurel's feet carried her, almost of their own accord, to a familiar door. Room 713. The storage room turned memorial, the place where it had all begun. She hesitated for a moment, then turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was bathed in soft morning light, giving it an almost ethereal quality. Jane's photographs smiled down from the walls, and the shelves were lined with books, some old, some new, all telling different parts of Douglas Academy's complex history. "I thought I might find you here." Laurel turned to see Brett leaning against the doorframe, a wistful smile on his face. "I couldn't leave without saying goodbye," Laurel said softly. "To this place, to Jane, to everything." Brett nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's strange, isn't it, how a place can hold so much? Pain and joy, darkness and light." "That's what I've been writing about," Laurel replied, holding up her journal. "The duality of it all. How the very things that haunt us can also be what heal us, if we let them." As if in response to her words, a gentle breeze swept through the room, rustling the pages of books and stirring the curtains. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Laurel could have sworn she saw a familiar figure reflected in the window, Jane smiling with pride and love. Brett must have seen it too, for he gasped softly, "Laurel, do you see?" But as quickly as it had appeared, the image faded, leaving only the ordinary reflection of the room behind. Yet the air felt charged, alive with possibility. Laurel moved to the center of the room, where a small table held a guest book filled with messages from students and faculty. Memories shared, apologies offered, hopes expressed for a better future. She opened her journal and carefully placed a folded piece of paper between its pages. "What's that?" Brett asked curiously. "A letter," Laurel explained. "To Jane, to Courtney, to myself, to whoever might need it in the future. A reminder that even in the darkest times there's always hope, always a way forward." As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift. The morning light took on a golden quality, and Laurel felt a warmth that went beyond the physical. It was as if the very walls of room 713 were responding to her words, to the truth and love they contained. Suddenly the door swung shut of its own accord. Brett started, but Laurel remained calm, somehow knowing that this was not a moment for fear. The air shimmered, and before them appeared three figures. Jane, young and vibrant as she had been in life. An older woman Laurel recognized from photographs as Elizabeth Courtney, the first to understand the weight of their family's legacy, and between them, a young girl with familiar eyes and a gentle smile. "Hello, Laurel," Jane said, her voice echoing as if from a great distance. "Hello, Brett." "Jane?" Laurel breathed, tears springing to her eyes. "Is it really you?" Jane nodded, her smile radiant. "It's us, all of us. The cycle is broken, the door is closed. But some connections, some bonds transcend even those barriers." Elizabeth stepped forward, her gaze intense. "You've done well, both of you. You've faced the darkness and brought light. The legacy of Douglas Academy is in good hands." Brett, his voice choked with emotion, asked, "And who?" The young girl between them smiled shyly. "I'm the one who might have been," she said softly. "The future that was lost, but also the hope that endures." Laurel understood instinctively. This was the child Jane and Brett might have had in another life, a possibility made manifest in this liminal space between worlds. "Why are you here?" Laurel asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "To say goodbye," Jane replied. "To thank you, and to remind you that though one chapter is ending, your story, all of your stories, are far from over." Elizabeth nodded solemnly. The power that Ambrose Douglas tapped into, the energy that fueled the cycle for so long, it's not gone, it's transformed. And now, it's up to you to decide how to use it. "Use it?" Brett asked, bewildered. The young girl laughed, a sound like silver bells. "To create, of course. To inspire, to heal. The door in the dark is closed, but so many other doors are opening. It's up to you to step through them." As she spoke, the shimmering in the air intensified. Laurel felt a surge of energy, of potential coursing through her. By Brett's sharp intake of breath, she knew he felt it too. "Remember," Jane said, her form already beginning to fade, "love is the greatest magic of all. It's what saved us. What will continue to save us." "We'll remember," Laurel promised, her voice thick with tears. "We'll never forget." With a final smile, the three figures vanished. The room returned to normal, sunlight streaming through the windows as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Laurel and Brett knew better. They had been given a gift, a final affirmation of all they had been through and all that lay ahead. For a long moment they stood in silence, processing the experience. Then Brett cleared his throat. "So," he said, a hint of his old humour returning, "I guess this means you've got some rewriting to do on that manuscript of yours?" Laurel laughed, the sound bright and free. "I suppose I do, but first—" She turned to face Brett fully. "I've made a decision about Headmaster Ramsay's offer."
Brett raised an eyebrow, waiting.
"I'm going to take it," Laurel said. "Not as a full-time position, but as a consultant of sorts. I'll split my time between here and my writing. This place, it's part of me now, part of us, and I think I can do some good here." Brett's smile was warm and genuine. "I think you're right. Douglas Academy won't know what hit it." Together they walked out of room 713, closing the door softly behind them. As they made their way through the now awakening school, Laurel felt a profound sense of peace. The weight of the past would always be with her, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it was a foundation, a source of strength and wisdom to build upon. Outside, Courtney waited by a taxi, ready to accompany Laurel to the train station. As Laurel hugged Brett goodbye and settled into the car with her sister, she looked back at Douglas Academy. The morning sun glinted off its windows, making the old building shine like a beacon. "Ready?" Courtney asked softly. Laurel nodded, feeling the weight of her journal in her lap, the stories it contained, both finished and yet to be written. "Ready," she replied. As the taxi pulled away, Laurel knew that while one chapter of her life was closing, so many more were just beginning. The door in the dark was shut, but countless others lay open before her, full of light and possibility. With Courtney by her side, the love of her found family in her heart, and the power of truth and storytelling at her fingertips, Laurel Snow was ready to step through those doors. Ready to face whatever adventures, whatever challenges, whatever wonders awaited on the other side. The story wasn't over. In many ways it was just beginning, and Laurel couldn't wait to see where it would lead. The end.